that's what we're doing at the moment, is running cows and calves. And also with pasture improvement, the more I listen to Neil, the more it sort of sinks in. I've always sort of known it, but you've really got to get that phosphorus reading up around where it should be, with all the readings anyway, with the fertilisers. And we put out quite a bit of DAP here, how long ago, about Christmas time, and the results have been tremendous. You know, the DAP certainly done a lot for us, but because that's got the highest percentage of phosphorus that you can put out, and Brendan recommended that, and it certainly worked. It's nice and dear. I think it's $1,000.60 a tonne now, so I did it when it was $700 a tonne, so that was a bit of a relief. Yeah, so basically that's what we're doing. I normally buy my breeders, but last year I had some pretty handy cattle, and I kept the heifers, and I joined them in December. I wanted to join them in September, but I couldn't get them to the right weight at that time, and it was a later decision. And those heifers that I kept joined to the Charolais bull, and they're up in the yards here today, so you can have a look at them and see what you think of those. They're due to start calving about September, October. In my world, that's too late, so I am going to sell quite a few of them, and might keep a few, but I like my cattle to calve about July, August, and when they do that, they're sort of ready to go, and we get the big flush of feed, or normally we get it anyway, come December, January, February. Yeah, so that's about all we do. The pastures have responded pretty well with all this rain that we've had, and in late April, and once again I should have done it earlier than that, I sowed quite 20 acres of ryegrass and clover, and it's due for another dose of DAP, but 1,060 worries me a bit, but you know, you've got to just go ahead and do it, I think. So they've responded really well. Yesterday was the first day I put these heifers on one paddock, so I think we're going to go and have a look at them through the day, so you can see what's happening. That's about it for me. Just while I'm here, I'd like to thank Brendan for organising these last 6 months. It's been very good. A lot of work goes behind the scenes, and also to Neil. Every time he comes, there's sprinkles of gold in what he says, and I go away thinking about it, which is good. And also to Ian. Ian's always here, and thank him. I have had quite a few phone calls with Ian over different little problems that I might have, and found him very, very helpful. And Todd Andrews, of course, is very good. I've known Todd for quite a while, and he's excellent. So I'd just like to thank them all for the efforts that they put in, and we're very lucky to have these workshops.
And we had an attempt at a bit of feed budgeting, I think, at the end, which probably spun a few people out a little bit, I think, including me. It usually does. But with the grazing management, was there any take-home sort of things that you got out of that? Anything that stuck in your mind as far as plant growth, grazing management, when you should or shouldn't? Or
One thing I got is I think I put on ryegrass a bit heavy, and it struck really well, but it has not filled out very good.
Yep.
So, lesson learned is that don't put it on any more than.
What sort of rate did you plant it at? Do you remember?
Probably about 60 kilos per hectare.
Okay. Yep.
And then I just broadcast some and mulched it in,
Yep.
And it turned out terrible.
I'm talking to everybody around the valley. I talked to Mark Phillips and Mark Hollis, who does contracting, as you know. Everybody's ryegrass is not growing this year.
It's not growing?
Not growing.
No, mine's stuck like it.
Some people have replanted because it was that bad.
Really?
But yeah.
Okay, I don't feel quite so bad about the mulching, but it just did not. It's patchy.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a question for the group: is there some reasoning for that happening this season as opposed to previously?
It happened about 5 years ago. It was the same thing.
Yeah, we've done full cultivation and planted, and we did the mulching and aerated and slashed the mulch and carried it in, and couldn't see any seed not covered. The paddock we did properly is now 6 weeks and it's nearly ready to graze, but it's only come on this last week a bit. The paddock we roughed in, I reckon it could be a month off.
Well, the one that I worked up, and that was worked up quite well. It's unbelievable, but it has not sweated. It's only about. If it wasn't wet now, I'd clean it
I'd
off.
be happy with that.
But yeah, I know but compared to what I normally get
Yeah,
and what
same.
Graham Richard got is across the creek from me, his stuff is really good.
This paddock house we planned to live with early last year, we had 50 weaners and split the 10 acre paddock, 53 or 54 weaners on it, and we'd split it in sort of half. We had 10 bulls and 53 weaners on it, and they couldn't keep up with it. This year, we haven't got any onto it
Okay.
yet.
Right, then. Oh, well.
No, mine's the same, exactly the same. It's so slow. Usually it's
But-
speeding the cattle.
But there's been warm days, there's been plenty of rain.
Yeah.
So what could the reason be that it's not?
Not
I've
a
had
number
couple
of frosts, is it?
Well, I've had a couple of little ones, not
Nothing major.
massive, but there's no reason for it, is there?
No, not that it's no.
Can you think of anything, Neil, that would
I've
cause it
got a
not to
few
rain?
thoughts running through my head, but Scott, that paddock that we walked through, what's it looking like now? I presume you've fed it off, have you?
Well, I would have if I had fencing, but
Yeah.
no, it's still slower than previous years, but it's the body of beef there.
Yep.
It's thick?
Yep.
Okay.
What rate did you sow it?
There's some. It's in two sort of stages. There's some volunteer stuff that came from last year, and then I planted it back to the acre.
25 kilos. So
Back to the acre or the hectare?
No, acre. Yeah.
So 2 bags.
And I only scrubbed it. I only just mulched it in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it wasn't.
The paddock was fully cultivated, but oats with it as well. Like oats and rye, I haven't seen oat planting.
Last year I tried oats that I bought and nothing came up, so I went back to where I bought it from and they give me a credit for it because it was dud seed, come from West Australia. And I
Right.
didn't keep a handful to see if it struck, but there are little critters in there, so that was it. It was a seed.
Can you get dud rye seed?
Dud rye, or would,
You can get dud anything,
Yeah.
but not often.
Okay.
Mostly it should be okay unless it's old seed. So ryegrass, like some of your clovers and things, you can pull them out of the shed 5 years later, good as gold. Probably, you may get better if they had really hard seed levels. It might germinate better than it would have 5 years ago, but ryegrass and things, 12 months, 2 years will pull them up usually. They're not long lived.
with clover and that, how do you know, if you look at it, besides say putting some other bit of cotton wool to see if it's going to germinate, if it's good seed or not?
You don't.
You don't.
You don't.
Just something, just a risky take.
Yep. You can do it in a lab. There's the stuff
Yeah.
they can put on it to check whether it's going to be
Criteria seed the same?
pretty much any of them are the same. Just looking at them, you've got to do that germination test.
Yeah, okay.
Whether that's on your cotton wool on the windowsill or
Yeah.
whether that's sort of out in the garden somewhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really the only way of
Okay.
checking. And they
No.
can.
Now, what's the recommended rate to put ryegrass down per hectare?
Yeah, well, I was going to comment on that. So with your ryegrasses, you've got your so-called diploid or smaller seeds, which tend to have the narrow leaf, like varieties like Concord and so forth. It's quite common. Half the varieties, or more than half, are just like the normal ones. And then you've got some that have a bigger seed, and they tend to be like the old Tortilla and the broad, got that broader leaf on them. So there's a little bit. First of all, there's a little bit of difference in seed size with your ryes, and that can affect your seed rate. Then, if you look if you look at well, go to something like clovers. If you look at what sort of, or lucerne or something, if you plant, you know, commonly, if you planted lucerne and every seed came up, a kilo per hectare would be more than enough. But in an irrigated lucerne paddock, you plant 15 kilos per hectare. Okay, that sort of allow for, it's not always 100% efficient, but if you just look at plant seed numbers, seed numbers, there would be plenty there. With your ryegrass, similar sort of things, like with your clovers, we plant maybe 1 to 4 kilos per hectare. If you get good clover set, good seed set in a clover paddock, you could get 100 kilos of seed. You know, seed produce, you know, if they're commercial producing seed where they've got, you know, everything right, they're getting like 400 kilos of seed per hectare. So 4 kilos is not very much, but it's enough if you look at your plant numbers. With your ryegrass, what we would commonly look at for those smaller seeded varieties, you know, the recommendations used to always be in the order of 20 to 25 kilos per hectare. Okay, if you went to the tetraploid, the bigger seed, you might up that. So instead of 20, it might be 25. Instead of 25, it might be 30. If you go to Queensland and have a look at what their recommendations were, they're about 40 to 45 kilos per hectare. And you know where that makes a difference? For your first grazing only. So it's really only your first grazing, because when it first comes up, you said you hadn't till it out very much. No. Okay, and that's what will happen. If you planted at 20 kilos instead of 60, they might have started, you know, now you have a heap more feed because you've got a lot more plants.
Yep.
Next grazing, the 20 kilos has tilled out a lot more. The 60 has still only got a couple of stems on it. And by the third grazing, they're both going to look exactly the same.
Okay.
With what's going on. So the ones that are thin are going to thicken up, and the ones that are thick are going to thin out, if anything. So yeah, your first grazing will be impacted by your seeding rate. The second grazing may a little bit. After that, it's all up to the season and your grazing management and what you've done. I would suggest. So you've got to think, how much did that extra 30 kilos of seed cost me? Am I going to get that much more grazing in the first grazing to make that worthwhile?
Those seeding rates you just mentioned, are they sensitive to how you're putting it on, as to whether you're spinning it on or whether you're ploughing it in?
Yeah, look, they are a bit. That if you drill it in is going to be more efficient than if you spin it on. So what we tend usually to do is when you're just spinning it on and going for rough and cheap, we spend the extra on seed instead of fuel and herbicide. But it sort of ends up sort of either way a little bit. But if, and I guess I always had a, you know, rule of thumb in mind that if I had a fully cultivated seed bed, I'm probably going to get a reasonable establishment, maybe 9 years out of 10. If I direct drilled, it might be 8 years out of 10. If I spin it on and I've done my prep right, so I may or may not have done a knockdown spray beforehand, depending on what I'm in. I've grazed it down hard. I may or may not mulch. Then I might be looking at sort of, you know, 6 or 7 years out of 10. If I go and throw it out in that whiskey grass over there, no preparation much, long feed, sort of, you know, no fertility and whatever, I'm pretty much sure that I'm never going to get an establishment, no matter how much seed I put out there. And if I do, then my ryegrass is going to die of old age before it grows any feed for me.
Because of everything above it.
Because of it won't come up because sort of, and it's a bit like, you know, what we're faced with after a good summer, and you go and mulch the paddock. If you mulch early, or you're thinking of mulching, if you mulch early, you get this layer of mulch, and then you throw your seed on top, not going to grow. If you throw your seed out and then mulch, you've got your seed down here with the mulch layer on top, not going to grow. So you've really got to get rid of it, you know, months beforehand, preferably by grazing it. But if you decide it, and that's where some of that grazing management-y stuff comes in, and say, well, I'm going to graze this paddock hard so I can plant that, and I'm going to leave this one tall and ugly out of the road and just not worry about it for now. And that's my backup paddock, that if this one doesn't work for some reason, at least I've got a paddock full of rubbish. That's, you know, that's my best case scenario when we've got a good season happening. So I guess the sorts of things running through my mind, you know, apart from the seed rate question, one of the other things, what weeds have I got? What fertiliser did I have? So you've had establishment, it's not growing. So after the sort of the wet weather you had, that's not an uncommon scenario anywhere. That you have all this sort of all the fertiliser things get buggered up. So you said you haven't used it enough, had enough growth out of it. What sort of fertiliser rates were put on when you planted the seed?
No, I didn't. I put nothing on with the seed. I just put urea on after about, would have been about probably 4 weeks.
Yep. How much?
That was 100 kilos a hectare.
100 kilos a hectare. What did you do?
I'm just feeding mine off very quickly and back fencing, and then I hope to put some fertiliser on.
So it's had no fertiliser on
No.
it, yeah? So that's the trouble with all that wet weather. You're pretty much guaranteed that you've lost all your nitrogen, okay? That it either got leached or turned into gas, but whatever happened, there would have been virtually no nitrogen there, and a lot of your phosphorus, because in waterlogged soil, particularly if it's a bit on the acid side, your phosphorus is going to get tied up. So you're readily available. The nutrients might still be there, but the plant can't access them. So it's a really hard sort of call. After that wet weather, you need more fertiliser. You'd probably be heavier handed than you normally did. But if you get more wet weather, you're going to lose it again. And it's nothing worse than I've just gone and put out 100 kilos of urea at, that's costing me $70 or $80 or whatever that's costing. And then I got another, within the fortnight, I've got another wet spell, so I've lost that. So I've gone out and spread another 100 kilos of urea because I know I need the nitrogen. Then I lose that, and you get a bit sick of it after a while. You just throw money away, and there's no way that we can change that. So then it becomes a call of what's going to cost me the most. Is it putting the fertiliser on and not getting the best response out of it, or is it not putting the fertiliser on and not getting the growth and having to go and buy in hay or grain or do something? I'm not going to have the feed, so that's pretty expensive as well. And there's a bunch of things there that are going on sort of, but we're not sure exactly what. And unless we can predict the future, it's easy with hindsight, but that doesn't help us much when we.
What I looked at was that if the cost of buying, say, 100 kilos of urea was nothing compared to the return you get from it.
Yep.
And as you've said, if you got to go and buy silage, that's 100, 120 a bale.
Yep.
And they'll go through that in a couple of days.
Yep.
So it's sort of a no-brainer for me to just put a bit of urea.
Got to get it out there, but that's so that, and I guess particularly looking at the paddock, you're looking is there any green spots out there? Is there any urine patches and things? That's a guarantee that sort of it's a nitrogen related thing, but how are you going to manage it? And if you've got patches of clover there, particularly if they're if things are growing better around dung pats and urine patches, that's pretty much a giveaway that it's not fertiliser related.
Yep.
And mostly it's going to be nitrogen, but it could be phosphorus, it could be sulphur, it could be potassium, but most of the time it'll be nitrogen.
Neil, just something to share. I was exactly there. Do I put it out now in another rain? And in that process, my fertilizer, which I bought, got damp. And anybody that made that mistake ever in your life, you put it in that spinner and it goes nowhere. It's horrible.
Was that a blended fertiliser? What the fertiliser was?
One was urea, two 1 ton bags of urea, and my apologies, I forget now what the other one was.
So often if you get one of those blended type starter fertilisers, they're even worse. Because they start reacting with each other in the bag.
The urea, it looks okay. You open it up when there's a bit of sunshine, then you put it on there, and the pressure, just that dampness, make it like pieces of cake, and then it becomes almost pieces of concrete. The other white one, which I forget now, that became like huge rocks, which you almost have to break up with hammers. That's 3 1 ton bags of investment and lots of faith in the spinner. So not a mistake that you make again.
Yeah, you sort of, that's the challenge, isn't it? You know, I buy it now at the right price, or do I let the store take that risk and sort of buy it when I need it? And that's just that's with so many things, yeah.
So there, I've put a bit over 100 kilos of nitrogen on my rice since I sowed it in April. And like when I was being slow, like, geez, the kikes kept going. And I put a lot of it down just being a long season for kike being wet and having growing conditions without the fertiliser on. It was down to bloody dirt when I sowed it, and kike, I guess, is an established root system, bounced back, and I like it putting, you know, kindergartners in with year 10 students throwing in food, and who's going to get it?
Yeah, established root system and everything, and you've got this other one just sort of coming from seed. So yeah, I guess the temperature thing is going to be a lot of it. It's been, you know, despite the snow in other parts, it's been relatively mild, so that keeps the kike not growing at its best, but ticking along.
Yeah, our first frost in our place about 10 days ago.
You've had a frost now, have you?
Yeah, it's not enough to really knock it, but it's slowed it down.
Yeah, gives the right stuff a bit of a chance, yeah. I guess a couple of other things. Oats are more sensitive to wet conditions, you know, compared to ryegrass. You've got your different varieties. You've got the old Saya, which is like a black oat, which is a glorified weed, which is fine when it's green and leafy, loses quality overnight when it runs a stem up, but it's going to be easy. But that big oat seed needs to be planted down in the ground. But the main difference with it is that it's more sensitive to waterlogged conditions. Otherwise, similar to ryegrass as far as needing fertiliser and all that sort of stuff. With when to graze them, we talked last time, we were talking about some of that grazing management stuff. The first thing is that the plant doesn't pull out, that the root system's established enough that it's not going to pull out. And then with ryegrass, we talked about it having 3 leaves. So you don't want it to get big and tall. That's like the way that we on the coast usually manage our oats particularly is pretty much the best way to kill oats that we can invent. You know, if you were set out to kill oats by grazing management, it'd be do what we normally do, which is let them get up reasonably big and then graze them down hard, because the growing point's up, and when and it's the same if you went through with a slasher. Once it's, you know, if you go down and you run your hand up the stem, start at the ground, run your hand up, and you can feel a bump, feel that node on the stem, that means that tiller, that stem, is not going to grow any more leaves. And if you cut it off, it's just basically that's the stem starting to run up. And if you cut that off, then you kill it. And that's often, I go into people are grazing oats, and the oats are up like this, first grazing, and it might be here. And it's pretty much the only grazing you're going to get off it. So if that's what you want, that's fine, but that's where, and particularly if we graze them hard, graze it right down hard. Whereas ryegrass, that growing point's right down near the ground, so it's harder to damage, you know, that's why it comes back, it's just easier to manage in that regard. But the other thing that you look at is when you open it up, that if you see yellow and dead leaves underneath, then it's got too tall before you graze it. So that's the sweet spot we're trying to get, is growth up, but no yellow leaves underneath. If we've got yellow leaves, we should have grazed it a week ago, so that it'll come back again with what's there. And that really doesn't matter whether it's this high or this high. How high it is, how big the leaves are is fertiliser. How many leaves there are, that's day length, that's sunlight that does that. So if you've got big leaves and starting to get those yellow leaves underneath, because you've got really fertile paddock and got really good growth, it might mean that you're grazing it off at 2.5 leaves on your ryegrass instead of 3 leaves. If it starts to lodge, fall over, again, it should have been grazed before it gets to that sort of stage. So there are reasons why you would graze before 3 leaves. Otherwise, 3 leaves is sort of the magic time to get in and try and graze, if you can, to then get the regrowth and everything else comes together. So I guess in looking at, you know, if I go out to a paddock and I'm trying to work out what's going on, and half the time you can't put your finger on it, and we know that after floods and things, I know there was blocks in the Hunter after the that big flood when those people died at Dungog, however long that's how long ago that was. After that, there were paddocks where nothing, or blocks in paddocks where water laid and nothing grew there for 6 or 12 months. And we could never really work out what it was. And that was just, but they were just, and it happened in more than one spot, but it happened around the place. So, you know, is it salt? Is it sort of, what is it compaction? What went on? We still don't know, but it was, you know, paddocks next door were growing okay. Not brilliantly, but okay. But then you had these blocks where nothing would grow. So sometimes we've still got a fair bit to learn with those things, but there's a few obvious ones, particularly around weeds, particularly around fertilisers, which we can have a crack at, but it's not ideal. You know you're going to have to use it. You know you're not going to get the return that you would under ideal conditions. But if you don't, then you've got nothing. I guess you've just got to keep trying.
Yep.
On the areas you're prepared to, and when that happens, that's when that locked up paddock of sort of old rank feed becomes extra valuable. Because at least you've got that sort of going into July, August when just roughage, you can supplement roughage, but if you've got to buy roughage in, then you're too slow because the mice have already eaten it. Otherwise, it would have been for cheap. Back to the other day then, or our first day when we were going through this grazing management pro-graze stuff with the handouts. I said that there were 3 things that you had to remember out of all the pro-graze stuff. There were 3 things you had to remember. We did 2 of them on the first day and we did 1 of them last time. What were those 3 things? This is pass or fail. This is lunch or no lunch. We're getting serious now. I'll give you a big hint. The first thing that you had to remember was that. Or that one. Remember that growth curve thing that basically said when it's short and leafy, it's high quality, and we put some digestibility and ME figures on that. Yeah. And as it gets old and rank, the quality drops. Righto? So that you had to remember that one. I said that you could basically, if you remember these 3 things, you can manage your pastures. Righto. The next one were these benchmark numbers. It says if there's a lot of feed out there, they can be they'll pick the best of it all the time. So if it's slightly lower quality, if there's enough of it out there, they'll do okay. And I guess my extreme example of that is some paddocks that we were monitoring of Rhodes grass, cattle going into this ugly looking old rank, dead leaves everywhere, and I'm thinking these bloody cattle are going to go backwards, and they put on a kilo a day. Of course, there was so much feed out there. They were at the stocking rate they had. They were able, and that was probably over a month. It wasn't just sort of today or tomorrow. Over the month, they averaged a kilo a day because they were able to get in and pick a good feed out of it, even though it looked terrible. Trouble was that once they picked the good feed out of it, then they performed as expected, and they were doing 0.2 of a kilo or something later on, because then they were forced to start eating that old rank rubbishy stuff. So that those benchmark figures are telling us things like if we've got a steer, if it's high quality, they're going to put on lots of weight. If it's low quality, they're not. Even though there's a big bulk of feed out there, and I think in one line here, if I haven't got my specs on, but if it was 75% digestible, 600 kilos, which is not very much at all, 75% digestible as your ryegrass at the moment, nice rocket fuel type feed. They only need 600 kilos of that out in the paddock on offer to be gaining at 0.4 of a kilo a day. If it's 68% digestible, they need 1,100, so they need twice as much. They've only dropped from 75 to 68, but the volume of the amount of feed they need to select from has doubled. And if it's 60% digestible, which is what a lot of our feed's going to be most of the time, it's 2,900 to gain 0.4 of a kilo, so it's more than double the gain. So just how important that if you want 0.6 of a kilo a day and 60% digestible, you can't do it. doesn't matter how much feed's out there, if you had one cow in a 10 hectare paddock of that quality, it still wouldn't do 26 of a kilo a day. So that one's you've got to get your head around, because that's that feed quality and quantity thing happening. Okay, and the one from last time. Is that one, which was saying the same, basically saying that was what we based our, with those other things in the back of our mind, that was what we based our grazing management on. Okay, so phase 1 down here, basically we've got short feed, it's high quality feed, there's not enough of it, and it's probably got bare patches across the paddock, so it's not catching all the sunlight, so it's not growing at its optimum. Then it gets into phase 2 where you've got total ground cover, so it's using all the sunlight that's hitting that paddock, and it's growing rapidly, so it's high quality and the quantity's going up. And then you get into phase 3 when it's starting to shade, you're getting dead leaves underneath, you've got a big bulk of feed, but the quality's going down, so you've got quantity but no quality, and it's starting to thin out and shade down. So from a grazing perspective, basically we want to stay in this phase 2 as much as we can. But there are times when we might go one or the other, times when we would go phase 1, particularly if we wanted to plant a paddock, broadcast into it. Okay, you're going to hammer it down, get rid of all the competition and rubbish so we can plant seed into it. Might be. So it's going to be in phase 1. And up in this phase 3, we've got a good season. So we've picked the paddock, we're going to lock paddocks up. We've picked the paddock that we want to let set seed. So we'd deliberately let it get up here, or it's just for whatever reason we're putting a paddock aside so that the paddock we're grazing is doing, the cattle are doing the best we can. Because if we let them all get up like this, we're feeling very comfortable. We've got a massive feed out there, but our cattle are only doing 0.4 kilo a day instead of we want them to do a kilo a day. Because everything's like this, so we don't want the whole farm to look at like the one thing. We don't want it all to look like this, or this, or this. We want to spread across the farm of paddocks that are in good for grazing now, good for grazing next week, next month, and an insurance paddock that sort of, and it might be preferably one that where we want to let it set silage
or something.
Sorry?
Do you use phase 3 for silage type things? Not necessarily. Preferably
silages are at top of phase 2. Okay, phase 3, and I guess Soteria is a classic. Phase 3, seed heads out like yay, I can get 200 bales off my paddock, and what's going to happen when I go to feed it out? Most of it will end up back in the paddock because they'll lie on it, they'll fight with it, they'll eat a little bit of it, but the wastage is pretty high. If I cut back here and my Soteria is down like this, then it's all good quality. I might only get 60 bales out of my paddock, but they're going to eat every skerrick of it, and what they miss the first time, they'll lick off the ground the next time. So quantity versus quality, and every time you do the sums, it's quality that drives production. And the challenge with that Soteria is those 200 bales, they cost me 35 or 40 bucks a bale to make, and those 60 bales of good ones, they cost me the same price. So making, I've got a lot more bales. My contractor loves me, but I haven't got it's out and carted. I've been doing a bit of silage stuff lately, and I've got a little, did a little sheet that showed that at 8 megajoules, right, and you can go back to that other sheet and see what digestibility that is. It's probably 65% digestibility or something. At 8 megajoules, it didn't matter what price you paid for your silage, you couldn't get your money back. At 10 megajoules, it didn't matter what price you paid for your silage, you couldn't help but make money. More money if it was cheaper or whatever, but yeah. But at the 8 megs, everything was negative, and at 10 megs, everything was positive with your feed conversions. Anything else you want to talk about with me before we give Ian a go? I'm around all day anyway, and we'll have another crack later on. The best part to look forward to is this afternoon. Brendan and I and Todd and everyone else is going to shut up, and you guys are doing the work. Best part of the whole day.
Yeah, cows and calves, yeah. So I guess some of what we'll talk about, Pat's not going to be particularly relevant for your enterprise.
Eventually it might be.
But we'll get onto that, yeah. So, I mean, I guess what's the sort of first thing that we look at when we're talking about setting up a management calendar would be calving. So what time of year does everyone calve? And it might be different.
Right now,
So in June, July, and what's the sort of thoughts behind why we calve when we calve?
I'm aiming for putting 9 to 10 month old steers into the weaner market in April, and then retaining heifers to grow out to red taggers. Out of those heifers, I'll keep some as replacements. I'm happy with the past breed tests. Others will go off as red taggers or empties, whatever. But the test comes back in around Christmas, January, February, sort of thing.
Yeah, so most of our weaner sales are an autumn weaner sale. Yep, so you want a good line of heavy weaners to put into those sales. Bill, you sort of talked about something?
Yeah, I think if you get your cows calving sort of tailing for winter, then the small calves can take all the milk if the cows have got really good feed, which you usually haven't got then. As spring unfolds and you get your better feed, then your calves have the ability to get the better feed, but also the cows produce more milk.
Yeah.
And then you've got that right through summer. So.
Yeah, and there's a few things to look at there. So one is like the demand, like how much is the calf taking? How much is the cow producing? So the cow won't start, like the peak lactation is not in the first week, there's a lag, and the peak of feed intake for the cow, there's a lag as well. So depending on who you talk to, ideally you'd have your cows on the best quality feed about 8 to 12 weeks after calving. So that's when they're going to be peak lactation, they're good feed intake, and so that's what we might aim for. But yeah, obviously, so you want them going on to good feed, not necessarily the day they calve, but you know, that sort of 2 months down the track. Yeah, and your calves are going to start grazing as well. There's sometimes other considerations, and I know that in areas some people will calve early to try and get out of tick season, so they want the calves born before paralysis ticks come along. But yeah, by and large, most people here would calve in July. I guess is probably a reasonable time. Some a bit later, some a bit earlier. But yeah, so when you calve's entirely up to you. But if you are looking at a restricted calving period, then usually July is about most common, I suppose. Do you all have a restricted joining period?
Yes.
Yes, Ian, I was just going to ask, it's also just doing a single calving. It's also doing a demand and supply issue with regard to everything hitting the market at the same time. And it was put to me by one of the local vets around here, cattle experience vet, that he's an advocate of twice a year calving for the reason of not being able to be forced into an oversupply, or being a price taker instead of a price maker sort of scenario.
Yep.
Do you find many people who do?
I see a small number of people who'll have a split calving and calve in autumn as well. One of the challenges there is getting that good feed for them to go onto. If you've got really good early ryegrass, then you'll get that. If your rye doesn't go so well, then you might struggle. But if you're prepared to feed them, it can be an option, certainly. And obviously there's plenty of people that join all year round, so calve all year round and have a smattering of calves pretty well any time of the year. So I mean there's no right and wrong. I mean, it's got to fit in with your enterprise and how you want to operate, and if you can get good money at different times a year to someone else, whether or not you'll get the calves to the same sort of weights that you're calving at a different time is, yeah, a question you'd have to look at, certainly. So if we're going to calve in July, then how do we control when we calve?
Sorry?
How do we control when our cows calve?
When
When they're mated. So really the only way we can control that calving period is by putting the bulls in and taking the bulls out at certain times. So yeah, obviously if we're calving in July, we're going to be joining in October. 9 months gestation or AI, if that's the way you're going to go. What sort of joining periods do people have?
Mine back to 8 weeks.
8 weeks, yeah. And
Hopefully they've had the 2 cycles in that time.
Yeah.
And what doesn't calve goes.
yeah, okay, yeah,
It's pretty nasty.
yeah. And you know, certainly, and I guess if you've got plenty of cows to join and you're happy with some empty cows, you can have a very tight joining period. A lot of people here will calve a bit longer.
We do ours a little bit longer because we're in the mountains and the bull's got to find to start with.
Yep.
There's got a lot of walking to do. Each there's bulls for different scenarios. But so we probably join a bit longer.
Yeah, yeah. So
We find when we're selling bulls, it was incredible when we were producing a lot of bulls and we were still selling bulls in February, March. For people who had obviously bought, I had a bull that didn't function and the cows were still cycling, so I'd like to say there's people, some people just join all year.
Yeah. And if you join all year, then potentially you can get calves all year. There will be some seasonality.
Then if your cows not, if you join over too long a period, you don't know whether your cows are only calving every 15 months.
Yeah.
They shy cows.
Yeah. And
AI, we usually join in after 10 days from AI.
yeah.
And then the cows that calve any sort of later than after we sell.
Yeah. And I see that all the time. Like, you know, people will tell me, oh yeah, we get, you know, every single cow calves every year, but it's not a 12-month year, it's a 13-month, 14-month, and every, you know, year the cows get laid and then they don't calve, you know. So yeah, 100%, like you really want that cow calving every 12 months. That's our aim, and by having a tight joining we can control a lot of things. We can control, you know, some diseases, Vibrio, those sorts of things. Yeah, Steve.
Good with our joining, just need out a bit. For instance,
Yep.
at the moment, I'm joining the heifers, they hit 360 kilos. So the first one's went the bull last week. That's 12 months old, 360.
Yep.
Once the heifers have been through, you'll basically move on to the herd. But then we'll preg test at about 4 months after joining, and at that point we'll make a decision on what we do with cows that are empty or heifers who are empty.
Yes.
So the joining is not so critical to us, it's the preg test that we're really relying on to give us the feedback.
Yeah, and so I guess, quick question, well there's 2 things there. One is the point about heifers. So joining your heifers a month earlier than your cows. So that gives them then that extra month for that second pregnancy. So you can bet that they've got that little bit longer to get back in calf for their second calf. And that's something that, do many people do that? So you obviously do. Does anyone else do that?
And they're usually cutting their teeth when they're calving for that first calf.
Yeah.
If the heifers are going to make the weight, we just cut them.
Yeah.
If they're not ready to join the 12 months, just cut them.
Yeah. And so you join, what age are you joining your heifers?
Yeah, about 15 months or so.
Yep. And you're getting that growth rates to get them to critical mating weight? Yep. So yeah, I mean, how long you join for? Typically, a lot of people around here, it'll be sort of 9 to 12 weeks. Might be a bit longer, might be a bit shorter. What works for you? But yeah, there's certainly that distinct advantage to having a tight calving interval. You'll have those weaners, you know, a good line of weaners rather than things spread out for, you know, 6 months. You'll get things of all shapes and sizes. Yeah, so that's sort of, I suppose, where we start when we're looking at a calendar for management practices, because when we're joining and when we're calving really drives when we're doing certain things. So prior to joining, what sort of things would you be looking at with your bulls? Sorry? Fertility testing, yeah. And, you know, like you wouldn't do that a week before you're going to put the bull in, because if you find a problem, you've got a week to sort it out. So yeah, you know, do that well before your planned start of mating date. And so if there is a problem there, you know. I get a lot of calls from people who say, oh, the cows aren't calving this year. You know, was it the bull? Were the cows cycling? No preg testing done. It's really, really hard to actually investigate a problem at the back end when we really don't know what's going on.
Yeah, any suggested ideal age to do fertility testing on bulls?
On bulls?
Yeah.
Oh, look, well, I do it before you buy them, or ideally they're done before you bought, so that you've got something.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I do them every year. I think it's a cheap insurance policy to see how your bulls are performing.
These are my own bulls, which now made their DNA testing. So
Yep.
I'm just asking what is the ideal age to test it. I don't want to test them too early and they come out not good.
Oh yeah, no, there's no point testing them when they're, you know, real little, because they won't be, they're not reached maturity. So, you know, 18 months. People, you know, there are people using yearling bulls. So if you're going to put them in real early, you can. But yeah, 18 months would be, you know, what, you know, is that, what age would you start using them, or you selling them? Or?
Yeah, there's one that I bought the cow PTIC from a Holstein, so I really would like to start using him in about 3 months.
Yep.
Maybe a little bit young, 16, 17 months at a time, so I'm giving him another few months to see how he grows out.
Yep.
Some of my own, which I want to test and then sell on, which just made their DNA testing. They're heading for 16 months and two is a bit younger, 14 months.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we're going to test the bull, or the other thing is, are you going to buy new bulls this year? So again, you want them well before you plan joining, so they can settle in, get accustomed to the feed. I mean, ideally, we see a bit of Tyleria in bulls brought into the area. So these are things that you need to consider if you're bringing a bull in. What other things would you consider doing with your bull prior to joining?
Vibrio?
Yeah, 100%. Does everyone with breeding herds vaccinate for Vibrio? Yeah. I just consider it such a common disease. We see so much of it. In a herd where we don't have a suspicion or have diagnosed Vibrio, just doing the bulls alone is usually enough to keep it out. It's a very good vaccine, it works really well. So yeah, if it's a new bull that's not been done before, they need 2 doses, 4 to 6 weeks apart. So you want that second dose before they're going in with the cows. If it's a bull that you've done in previous years, then it's a single dose, and again prior to joining. Some people will vaccinate their heifers for Vibrio as well. So depending on your herd size and the pack size that you get, you might want to just give the heifers a dose prior to their first mating as well. Most people don't vaccinate their cows, although herds where it's been diagnosed, often will. So these are things we want done prior to joining. Other things like, a 5-in-1 or 7-in-1 vaccine prior to joining, so your bull's all set to go as well. Feed, we're looking at, what's the bull's condition like? Well before joining, we want him going in with the girls, ready to go. So these are all things you're sort of planning for prior to joining. Same deal with the cows, so vaccinations with the cows. When do people sort of look at doing that?
Typically, about 4 weeks before calving is their follow-up 7-in-1.
Yep. So, yeah, ideally we want the cows vaccinated in late pregnancy. Some people would probably mightn't go quite 4 weeks. Obviously, you want to avoid handling heavily pregnant cows. Sometimes the closer they get to pregnancy, stress can induce calving. But yeah, so sort of 4 to 6 weeks prior to calving. And I'm a strong advocate of 7-in-1 in breeders. So 7-in-1 will do your clostridial diseases, so black leg, pulpy kidney, tetanus, those sorts of things, as well as 2 strains of Lepto. Now, Lepto, I don't see a lot of disease in cattle due to leptospirosis. You can see it occasionally. If ever there's a year we'll see it, these wet years tend to be when we see it. So yeah, 7-in-1, prior to calving. And what that does is you're actually giving that cow's immune system a boost prior to calving. When she calves, those antibodies go through the colostrum into the calf. So at birth, calves essentially don't have immunity to anything. They're relying on that colostrum, the first milk from mum, to get the antibodies they need to protect them. And those antibodies last for, does anyone know how long in the calf? They're called maternal antibodies. So that's the antibodies they get from mum.
6 weeks?
Yeah, up to about 12 weeks. Yeah, so after about 12 weeks, the protection from the colostrum, so the antibodies they've got through mum are starting to wear off. So that's sort of, you want to make sure that your calves have started their own vaccination course by that 12 weeks of age. Any other vaccines that people give their cows prior to joining, or heifers?
We got caught using Queensland Pestivirus.
Yeah.
And it took a while to realise we had a lot of breeders, and then you started thinking, well, hang on, they're not all calving, and then a whole bunch of them calving, and you had to cull a lot. And we've never Pestivirus vaccine before that.
Yeah.
Is that a problem here?
Pestivirus is very, very common.
We've got a lot of raising cattle out where we are, and the neighbours don't think of these things, so
Yeah.
you get dirty cows coming in, the bulls are crooked, the cows are crooked.
Yeah, so Pestivirus, there's been a lot of survey work done looking at Pestivirus, and about 80% of herds will have some evidence of exposure to Pestivirus. That's not to say there's active infection at that point in time, but they'll have, say, some cows or whatever in the herd that have been exposed at some point in their life. So it is a really common disease.
Are they carriers then?
No. So the way Pestivirus works is that it'll cause problems if you expose a heifer or cow to the virus for the first time in her life while she's pregnant. So it can cause problems in feedlots and stuff as well through immune suppression, but the problems we tend to see are where you introduce it into a herd, say a mob of heifers, they've never been exposed before, they're pregnant, a carrier animal gets in there, and what you see will depend on the stage of pregnancy that they're at. So so in the first month of pregnancy, they resorb the embryo and they'll start cycling again, and you'll end up with, late calvers, or with a restricted joining period, they'll just be empty because they won't have started to cycle again in time to get back in calf. From about 1 month to 4 months of age, the calf will actually incorporate the virus into itself as it's developing, and they're the carrier animals. So when those calves are born, they come out shedding virus in pretty much all their body secretions, and they're then a source of infection for everything else. Later in pregnancy, we see problems with calves with developmental abnormalities, so sometimes their brain's not developed properly, eyes not developed properly, you can get abortions, stillborns, weak calves, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's 7-in-1 Vibrio, everyone should be vaccinating for. I don't think there's any question there. Pestivirus, my advice to people is to, test a selection of the herd first to see whether you've got exposure to it. If your cows have been exposed in the past, then they'll have antibodies. The antibodies from that natural exposure are pretty long-lived, so they'll probably last out the life of the cow. If you have a herd with very minimal exposure, so your females have no antibodies, or a very small proportion of your females have antibodies, then you could consider vaccination. Or you need to be very, very careful in how those females are managed and that you don't introduce a carrier, because that's when you see a disaster. And I've seen, herds where they've had a calf drop and 30% of the calves have been born as carriers. The majority of them die at a young age. You end up with a lot of pneumonia, calf scours in that calf drop. So yeah, it's one that is not necessarily a must-do, but it's certainly something to think about, maybe consider doing some testing, and then base a vaccine decision on the results of that testing. And then in subsequent years, if you're retaining heifers, you test half a dozen of those heifers prior to joining, or prior to thinking about joining, see what their exposure is. If those heifers haven't been exposed, then again you could consider vaccination. So if you're a completely closed herd, you don't have straying cattle, you don't have neighbours with cattle, and you don't have pestivirus, the only way you will get it is through an introduction of a carrier animal. So if your biosecurity is perfect, and your fences are perfect, and your neighbours are low risk, then you can keep it out. If you bring it in, you can have a disaster. So yeah, it's not a cheap vaccine. It's about $4 a dose, I think, nowadays, and they need 2 initially and a booster every 12 months.
It's a cheap insurance though, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I've worked with a few herds over the years and diagnosed pestivirus, and they've started vaccination programs on non-exposed heifers coming through, and they said to me, all these little problems they used to see just seem to stop. Because it's a funny disease in that if you expose animals that aren't pregnant, it can cause some suppression to their immune system, so it makes them more susceptible to respiratory infections, worms, pink eye, all sorts of other infectious things. So controlling pestivirus can help reduce the risk of some of those other infectious diseases. So pestivirus would be one to think about for your females. A lot of bulls are tested prior to sale nowadays, so to show that they're not carriers. So it's not to say that they've not been exposed after birth, but they weren't exposed in utero, so they're not going to bring it into your herd. So that's one thing that you can look for if you're buying a bull in. Has it been tested so it's not a carrier for pestivirus?
If you're doing your normal, your 5-in-1, and then if you decide to change over to a 7-in-1, is there any conflict there with going that one step out with the 7-in-1?
No. So, I mean, ideally give them 2 doses because they won't have had that primer for the Lepto side of it. So, but yeah, no, the other 5 that it protects are exactly the same. So if you're running steers, bullocks, 5-in-1's probably fine. So Lepto, it can be transmitted to people. Yeah, everyone knows that. So if you're, the risk to people is through urine splash. So if you've got breeders, you're assisting a cow calve, there's urine there, that puts you at risk. If you're running steers, the chances of you getting splashed by urine are pretty low from a steer. So, I'm comfortable with 5-in-1 in steers and bullocks, 7-in-1 in breeders. I would be, pushing for as much for that. Protect yourselves as protecting the, problems that we sometimes see in cattle from Lepto.
Speaking of 7-in-1, is it true that 7-in-1 loses its efficiency after, say, 2 months? Because I used to be told that 7-in-1 I've always used 7-in-1 would last for at least 4 to 6 weeks for the 2 shots. However, it really loses its efficacy after about 4 weeks and as you said, it's up to 6 weeks. Do you agree with that?
In terms of the protection in the cattle?
Yeah. You should throw it away and buy a new batch.
Oh, once you've opened it?
Yeah.
Oh, so you mean you've opened the bottle, and taken doses out of it. Different products are different, So some of the products now have a longer like a broach period. So you open it, you use some, you can put it back in the fridge for a period of time and it'll still be all right. But most of them, have a limited period where you can use them.
So it could well be 4 weeks and therefore buy a smaller bottle rather
Yeah.
than a massive one.
Yeah. So my advice would be to buy a pack size that you're going to use up quickly. Don't buy 100 doses and use 50, this time and 50 next year.
Oh, no,
yeah.
Next year, but in 6 weeks.
Some of them 4 to 6 weeks you'll get by. Yeah, just check the label of the product you're using. And the risks there is one is contamination. So if you end up getting bacteria into the vaccine container, it gets contaminated pretty easy. And the other thing is like the handling of those vaccines, they need to be kept cold. So if you've been at the yards and it's been out and it's got warm and then you put it back in the fridge, that will affect the efficacy of it as well. So when you go to the store to buy it, take a little esky with an ice grip and keep it cold on the way home. Don't put it on your seat of your car and go to the supermarket and drive home, because it will affect how well that vaccine works.
Ian,
Yeah.
you mentioned maternal antibodies. What about if you're concerned about ticks and indoor Tyleria in your calves? Can you give your cows a Mectin product, and would they pass any of that on through the milk?
So we've done a fair bit of work with Tyleria, and the trouble with Tyleria is that the ticks will get on calves pretty much the moment they hit the ground. And you're not going to get much that's going to stop the tick from at least getting on and biting the calf. And so, I don't think that doing your cows is going to protect you against Tyleria at all, to be honest.
Paralysis tick, I was referring to.
Oh, paralysis ticks? Yeah, again, no, I don't think that, I don't think the Mectins work that well anyway for paralysis ticks, but the tick will need to feed before it gets the chemical.
Yeah.
And so, I wouldn't go that way. If I have paralysis tick problems in calves, personal opinion is those Vitex Python tags would be the way to go. You can put them in at day old. I know it's a hassle, but the people I know that have used them get far better results than anything else. There's a few other, other people are using injectable Mectins. I'd go with the ear tags any day of the week. Yeah. Do you think they work?
What's that?
Yeah. Treating your cows?
No, but it's a question that used to come up
from
time to time.
Yeah.
No, I never recommended it.
No.
No, we're chasing our cars to get, a couple of mils of boron on them as soon as we can. The paralysis ticks just seem to have increased.
So the trouble with paralysis, and I suppose you can put that in your calendar too, is like where you look for paralysis ticks. So our tick season really is from about August through to paralysis ticks. August through to about Christmas time would be when our ticks are at their peak, which just happens to coincide when we have small calves on the ground, unfortunately. So, as I say before, people calving a bit early, I know people that are calving June, just so their calves are a couple of months old before that tick season really sort of ticks over. There's really a limited number of products that are effective that actually offer any period of protection for paralysis ticks.
And we had a huge problem with ticks, like going 40 odd years ago, started we got the first salt and sulphur blocks manufactured. If you've got a tick problem and you get the salt and sulphur blocks out with your cows through the winter, they do build up immunity through the calf when it's born.
Yeah. So there's been some studies done with lice in sheep and sulphur, and there is some evidence to say that sulphur can help with ticks. Having said that, I've seen people still have problems with ticks even with sulphur blocks out, but it can help. But the products that we've, in terms of chemical products, managing your pastures can help a bit too as well. at managing the paddocks that you have your little calves in can help as well. So you'll find some paddocks will be a lot tickier than others. You know, obviously if you keep the pasture a bit shorter, that can help with tick control as well. But essentially the products that we've got available that are registered for paralysis tick control are all sprays or dips. Not many people have dips around here. Or the Whitex Python tags. And yeah, I've just had pretty good success with them in places where ticks are a real problem. You know, with sulphur as well. But you know, other people, you know, have talked about fertilising paddocks and, you know, improving soil fertility and that sort of thing making a difference. But some places are just ticky. Yeah.
Hey, yeah, and just off the point, what do you think of that MultiMin injected? Any good or no good?
Okay. So MultiMin, is everyone aware of it? So it's a mineral product that contains copper, selenium, zinc and manganese. It's designed and marketed as a booster for animals prior to stressful periods. So, you know, maybe cows prior to calving, calves at weaning, that's prior to joining perhaps, those sorts of times. We see copper deficiency in the area, we see selenium deficiency. I've never seen zinc deficiency or manganese deficiency in the area. If you've got a copper deficiency or selenium deficiency, there's not enough copper or selenium in MultiMin to actually correct a deficiency. If your cows or your herd is marginal, then yeah, it might provide them something. There's been some work done.
Are you talking about the lick or the injection?
No, I'm talking about injectable. You're talking about injectable, aren't you? Yeah. So MultiMin's the injectable. I think Vaccinating is a lick, and there's a few other licks as well. So I think a lot of people get hung up on minerals and vitamins and stuff. If you're looking at nutrition of cattle, energy and protein, and then the vitamins and minerals are like the herbs and spices at the end, personally, I'd say to you, see how, you know, give it a trial on your place and see if you get a response from it. If you get a production response from it, then use it. I see a lot of people use it and I question whether they would get a production response from it. There's some work there has been some work being done and Todd's involved and LLS is involved in some work at the moment. One of the things they're looking at is actually the immune response to cattle given vaccinations and see if MultiMin plays a role in actually improving the immune response. And part of that will be that there's selenium in it, so selenium's involved in immune function. Copper is to a lesser degree, and zinc is as well. So, you know, there are some theories that, yeah, there could be some benefit to it, but if you have a true deficiency, there's not enough in it, or you'll need to give it so often it becomes quite an expensive way to supplement. You know, it's a bit like lick blocks, and we're off the topic of the calendar here, but that's fine. You know, lick blocks provide usually very little amounts of stuff, and they're quite an expensive way of buying it. You know, so you've got to look at these things and go, well, am I going to get a return on my investment from that MultiMin? I know a lot of people that will buy cattle in and they give everything a MultiMin and everything an AD and E, and are they getting a return? Questionable.
So it plays zero role in immunity because it's minerals, it's not vitamins necessarily.
No, selenium does play a big role in immunity, yeah, and zinc does as well. Copper to a lesser extent, but yeah, it does. So selenium and vitamin E are really critical in immune function. And so, you know, a lot of people will talk about vitamin E or selenium, and you know, if you supplement that, you see less pink eye, for example. So yeah, certainly MultiMin could have an effect on immune function, provided the animals need those minerals.
My practice is calf on the ground today, Python tag in, bit of MultiMin.
At day old?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Unless you say I should not do that.
Oh, well,
Stop me from doing something wrong.
I'm always reluctant to say don't do something, but I guess I like to have a bit of science behind things.
Yeah.
And I like to know that, you know, if you spill, what's a dose of MultiMin cost you?
It's expensive.
Oh, a bottle, I think it,
Yeah.
the bottle was about 100
Given the calf,
160 or something.
Yeah.
You give that,
Well, I'd be careful giving it to calves, especially if you don't know the, particularly say copper status of your cows.
You write up on the box, hopefully not written by pharmaceutical salespeople, says at tagging. Obviously, the question is also where does people tag? Is it necessarily day old?
Yeah, I would think they'd, like, if they're talking tagging, they're thinking marking as opposed to putting Python tags in day old. Yeah. But yes, it's a question I think that, you know, a lot of people ask me about MultiMin. It is common. I'd love to know how much of it's sold through the local rural stores. I think a fair bit of it. Are you going to get a return on the investment?
Big advertising campaign.
That's a question I can't answer, and it's probably going to vary a lot between different properties and even between seasons, I think. You might find some seasons you do, some seasons you don't. I'd be very interested if any of you, have a few and you want to do something, we can maybe do a little bit of a trial and do half and leave half and see whether you get any differences in growth rates or, any differences in, pink eye prevalence in treated and untreated. It's an interesting question. I don't know, Todd, you got any?
No, I think you should be able to shed some light on it about 6 months' time. So we're working on a project with Burback at Wombarn. So we sourced steers from 5 or 6 different properties, and we did all the blood work on their background minerals, and so we've got supplemented and unsupplemented. So they've had every vaccination that we could think of, and so we're monitoring the vaccination response. They'll go through feedlot, and we'll monitor feedlot response as well. So,
And you're doing growth rates on them as well.
Growth rates.
And those animals were not deficient based on blood results.
That's right.
Results were.
Some of the copper was borderline low, like at the bottom end of the recommended range, so that was good.
So it's not being used, like they're not truly deficient animals, I guess. It's being used as a top up or a supplement as opposed to something to correct a deficiency. But it'll be interesting to see those results.
What's your thinking on B12? On any sort of coastal property we've been having, always given B12 3 times a year to everything. The copper deficient on most of those places.
Yeah, so
B12 you can see seriously almost on the instant, but pretty quick response, particularly in the back cattle.
Yeah, okay. So copper deficiency we certainly see. B12 is a bit different. So B12 in cattle relies on cobalt intake.
Cobalt.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're saying copper.
Yeah.
Sorry, cobalt.
Yeah. So cattle actually don't need cobalt themselves. They need the cobalt for the bugs in the rumen to manufacture B12, which the animals need. I've never diagnosed a B12 deficiency in the region. I've looked. It's not something I see a lot of. Copper deficiency we certainly see a lot of, and you will see those changes in coat colour. B12, I've looked for it, never ever diagnosed it. So I'm interested that you feel you get a response from it.
They were cattle, it was more wasn't it, the cattle that appeared to be almost anemic looking.
Yep.
And then the vet sort of said, well, that's a sign of it, the deficiency. And then we started doing this, and the problem went away.
Yeah, right. And so when you say up north, where's...
So we would go, they're drenching and a bit anemic looking.
Yeah. So where's up north?
He's up to back there.
Oh, okay,
And also down in New South Wales, on the coast of Casino.
Yeah.
They've used it for years.
Yeah.
You can see the difference in the stock.
Yeah. No, well, as I say, I've looked for it. Never diagnosed a cobalt deficiency in this area, which would then lead to B12. Yeah.
How about casino area?
Oh, I don't do enough up there to sort of comment. Yeah. Don't know. Have you heard of any cobalt deficiency, Todd?
No, I've never seen it written up at like events, conferences or anything like that.
No. So, I mean, certainly cobalt deficiency is well recognised in certain areas, but I've never seen it here.
So what here do you mean right here in the coast?
Yeah, so I cover an area sort of from, I suppose, Laurelton up to Coffs Harbour. Never diagnosed it. And even further north, I think around Grafton, I'm not aware of any up through there either. Copper we see a lot of, particularly on the lower country, a lot of copper deficiency.
Can you, based further to the session we had at Pembroke Hall and buffalo fly, given the season that we're going into, there's a lot of opinions, and obviously use a dual active drench, but there's a lot of people that talk about rather injectable drench versus the typical backline. So can you give us direction on that, please?
Yeah, and Todd might like to chime in here because they've been doing a bit of work on injectable drenches too. We are starting to see resistant worms in cattle. So resistance in sheep has been a massive problem for years. Cattle, not so much a problem. We are starting to see quite a bit of resistance, particularly to the Mectins, the MLs, whereas some of the older products like the orals, the levamisoles and your white drenches are still very effective. Some of the work that Todd's been involved with recently, and I don't know if you're happy to comment on that, Todd, with the injectables, is that their performance hasn't been fantastic.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, we first did the Coron. We had a Coron trial at Duck Creek, which is low-lying country between Grafton and Valna. And so the old products did work. We used them as oral, so that was the old levamisole, which is your milburn, and also the white drenches we used at Oxkin. So they were effective, but the Doramectin, which is your Dectomax, so it was totally ineffective, like same as control animal. So those steers were 13 kilos lighter at the end of 3 months. And so we're doing a follow-up trial at Pierce's Creek a bit further north this year. And we had to hold off treating the stock for about 2 to 3 months, for winners in January, February. And we've tried a whole range of injectables and nothing with the milburn in it. So just all Mectin products for the most part. And the stock has just been losing weight. We haven't been able to turn it around. But we're stepping in all guns blazing next week.
And they've still got worms.
Yeah, massive reinfestation.
So the products haven't been particularly effective. So there's a few products available now that are combination products. So Cydectin Platinum is recently come out. Eclipse. So they're both ML levamisole combo that are porons, and there's a product called Trifecta, which is an oral drench. So it's an ML, a white drench and a clear drench all together. So a lot of drench stuff's been done in the sheep world where resistance is really common, and one of the things that they really push now is using combination products. The idea being is that if you've got some resistance to one of those chemicals, hopefully one of the other chemicals in that product will wipe those resistant worms out, and you actually extend the life of all the chemicals in that product, as opposed to the old, drench with one product now and then change it for the next time you drench. One of the other things in cattle which I think sort of helps us a little bit is that adult cattle tend not to require routine drenching. So I don't, how many people here put, or drench their adult animals, so say cows past their first calving?
I do, but it's more, yes, the byproduct is for the worms, but the primary being when the buffalo fly arrives.
So you're using like Cydectin, something, are you? Yeah.
And also that Genesis does for the liver fluid in mature and immature, which we had trouble with after flood. So
yeah, okay.
we started using that as a combination.
Whereabouts is your place?
Burton.
So yeah, I was going to say, we don't see a lot of liver fluke in this area, but up where you are, we start to see a bit. So on the coastal strip.
Yeah. It's a hormone combination. We've never used it before, but I actually put some of the cattle away at the store and I thought they'd gone backwards with calves on them, but we'll just see what happens. Never used it before.
Must be a combo product.
It's a combination of white and chili. It does the three stages.
One of those plus ones or ultra or something, yeah. So yeah,
we marketing thing, I don't know, but we thought try it. It was quite expensive, so.
Yeah, so it'll have triclobendazole in it for the liver fluke. So yeah, we really don't liver fluke in this area. So when I say this area, the area that I cover is quite rare. Once you start to get further west, where you are, we start to see a little bit of it. But for everyone else, I'd say don't jump in and use a Fluke Drench unless you've diagnosed liver fluke on the property, because it is uncommon. Or you're buying cattle in from fluky areas. So if you're buying cattle in, say from Gloucester or up around Casino, tableland sort of stuff, they could come in with liver fluke. So it is not something we see that often. But yeah, up there, so So just the top of the play is a bit the same. We start to see a bit up there, but along the coast here we don't.
Is that because of the springs rising?
Yeah. So liver fluke, the part of the life cycle is through a snail, and for whatever reason, the snail just doesn't like the coastal strip here. Once you get inland a bit, it'll go all right.
Are they the little snails you get in the trough, or are they a different style?
No, well, it's unusual to find them in troughs. They are quite a small snail, so it's not every snail that'll transmit liver fluke. It's only a few species. They are quite small, but they do prefer like slowly moving water as opposed to water troughs or dams. I have seen them in water troughs, but it's not that common.
So that's a different snail in the trough?
Yeah.
We usually, we always put the copper blue stain in the
Yeah,
troughs and they inflate the top, you skip them off.
Yeah. So it can help keep it quiet. I suppose we talked about worm control. So when do people look at drenching cattle? I sort of mentioned adult cattle over 2 years of age, I wouldn't routinely include for worm control. Adult cattle tend to have pretty good natural resistance to worms, so you don't see a production response to a drench. It's not to say time to time you might see an animal that gets a bit wormy, dry times, nutritional challenges, those sorts of things. But after about 18 months, 2 years of age, cattle do develop pretty good natural resistance. So we should be targeting our worm control on our young stock. So calves from weaning, up to those sort of first calf heifers would be what I'd be looking at. Or if you're buying in cattle, what are you buying in weaners?
Yeah, I have been.
Yeah.
But at the moment, anything.
Yeah. So with your young stock, I'd be looking at worm control in February, March, then maybe again in May, and then in September, maybe in June. Maybe in November, December, depending on the season. But every sort of 3 months in young stock. And I would be drenching bulls as well, and that'd be prior to joining. I'd give them a dose, and then when they come out, I'd give them another one. And again, maybe sort of earlier in the year. So on fluke, we do see stomach fluke in the area. I don't know if any of you had much to do with stomach fluke. Particularly on some of the lower country, we see a lot of stomach fluke, and it can cause problems in young stock, particularly in sort of yearling type cattle, and they'll get a really watery diarrhoea and waste away. So there's actually no product on the market that is effective for stomach flu control, that is registered for stomach flu control. So if you walk in the rural store, you won't see stomach flu written on the label of any product. Nilzan, which is an oral drench, is regarded as being quite effective. So some people will drench, or where they've got heavy stomach flu problems, will drench all their cattle, including cows, with Nilzan once or maybe twice a year, just to control stomach flu. The adult cattle, you won't see clinical signs in them, but they can carry quite heavy burdens and produce quite a lot of eggs. So it's more a way of controlling that pasture contamination. And that would normally be done in sort of April. And Nilzan will control your roundworms as well. So it's got levamisole in it. So yeah, if you've got a stomach flu problem, then an April drench with Nilzan can be worth doing. Yeah.
Well, how do you know if you've got a stomach flu?
So testing, so you can do egg counts. So it's a slightly different test. So yeah, you can do egg counts to see if stomach fluke's there and what sort of levels you've got. Or sometimes I'll diagnose it, through animals that are clinically affected. So those yearling cattle get this real watery diarrhea, and it's due to stomach flu. But worm testing, like fecal egg counts, are a useful tool in young cattle, particularly to see what's going on, or for older cattle looking for either liver fluke or stomach fluke. And that'd be just if you've never had a problem, it's unlikely you've got a heavy burden there, but it is something to be aware of in the area. Bot flies in cattle, don't see too many dramas with them. I saw a few places earlier this year with stable flies. Well, actually, no, late last year with really heavy infestation of stable flies, which I don't usually see too many reports of, but they were significant late last year. And it was funny because people were ringing saying, "Oh, I got flies," and it was a bit early for buffalo fly, and they were stable flies. So I don't know what caused that, just the weather conditions, I suspect.
Do you find that the buffalo flies, the season for them is a bit longer now?
Yeah. So we talk about buffalo fly here in the calendar now if you want. So we would potentially start to see buffalo fly from about late December. Like if they're around at Christmas, that's early. More commonly it's sort of January, February, we start to see them. So from about December through to, April, May really, that's when we'd be monitoring for buffalo fly and then treating them. So the triggers that they talk about for treating for buffalo flies, about 200 flies on an animal, or you're starting to see signs of fly worry. So if you're starting to see, cows scratching, getting the sores on them, then you want to be getting in and treating. We do see a small number of animals that are they're allergic or hypersensitive to the flies, and you'll see that they'll have very few flies on them and they're tearing themselves to bits. So you sort of need to treat them a bit earlier from welfare grounds, but they're ones that, if you're looking to cull animals, there may be ones that you would cull because they do drive you to treat a bit earlier because they react more to lower numbers. To answer your question, yes. So buffalo fly first started to be seen down around, or as far south as Campion in about 2000, and they've sort of been marching south pretty well since they were introduced into Australia. They came in at Darwin, came along the top and down the east coast. And, you could argue, is it changing climate, changing season? You're talking about an insect that has a life cycle of 10 days, so they can adapt, build up adaptation to different climates fairly quickly too. So I think they will just keep marching further south. As they do that, they'll probably hang around longer for here. So the further north you go, the season is longer.
Yeah, because when we were up there in Queensland, it was almost 12 months of the year. It had some effect of some buffalo flies nearly 12 months of the year. Yeah. And then there was a heavy period, but they were still hanging around.
Yeah. So temperature dependent, and so what we find down here is that how early we see them and often how severe the season will be driven a bit by the winter that we have. So if we get a really cold winter, heavy frosts, then the flies don't overwinter as well down here. If we get a milder winter, then you'll get small populations of flies survive through the winter, and then as it warms up, they breed up really quickly again. So we'll get them, you know, earlier in the season, so more into December, early January, and they'll push right through. And there's still small numbers of flies about now. I don't know if anyone's got dog buffalo fly about still. Still a few about. So then in terms of control of buffalo fly, we would, the decision of when to treat's based on those numbers. So it might be, you know, as early as January, or it might be quite late in the season. The later we get in the season, you know, if we start to see in January, I'd say, well, you know, it's probably a good year to go with ear tags. You'll get 12 to 16 weeks protection, depending on the product that you use. If you're seeing them turn up later in the season, so it's sort of March, April before we get many, then you might just go with a spray or a pour-on product. That'll only probably give you 3, maybe 4 weeks, and you'll need to redo them. But where we've got a longer season, and I think we will start to see longer buffalo fly seasons, ear tags are a good option.
So the thing this year, and Sue was saying the same, I put tags in December, and they were effective for about probably 2 weeks.
Yeah, what
Python?
Python, yeah. So they're a pyrethroid tag. Like worms, we see resistance. So if you got flies back after 2 weeks, then that's telling us that those flies are resistant to synthetic pyrethroids. So you look at, you know, an organophosphate tag. There's also a Mectin, an ML tag as well. So that'd be another option.
And put Cybectin on, they were gone straight away.
Yeah, but for what, 2 weeks?
Oh,
3?
yeah, probably a bit longer, but it was just a really bad year for buffalo, for flies.
Yeah.
So, for example, the porn and etc., does it actually just discourage those buffalo flies, or does it kill the ones that go and suck on the cow while the torrential sow is effective?
A bit of both, depending on the product. So some products will actually kill the fly, and some are more repellent, I guess. Yeah.
We found Angus cattle that eat alive by ticks and flies. We've got a lot of drought mass from Vaccinating across with Charlotte, whatever. The silica-coated cattle, no flies, no ticks, no troubles.
Yep.
The black cattle just drive you crackers because you're very treated with something.
Yeah. So
is
there's
that the hair or the silica coat or the Vaccinating?
Yeah, coat. Yeah, well, breed and coat.
And no eye trouble.
Yeah. So buffalo fly, you'll find them heaviest on black animals or dark coated animals, bulls, and anything that's a bit poor. So, but yeah, Bos indicus type cattle would be more tick resistant and more fly resistant. Yeah.
You can have them all in the 2 lots in the same yards, all treated the same. They need black cattle buzzing with flies still after they're treated, you know, previously. The droughties and the Bos indicus type, nothing like that.
Yeah. So in terms of the fly control products, yeah, you've sort of got synthetic pyrethroids, organophosphates or Mectins. We are seeing a bit of resistance to the pyrethroid products. So like Saw put the tags in 2 weeks later, you've got flies again. Suggests that the product's not working. So yeah, maybe look at an organophosphate. Synthetic pyrethroids, we do see a bit of resistance.
Is that only for that one particular person's herd, or is that all on the big broad picture of things?
The flies do move around, so they will fly. I mean, they don't fly hundreds of kilometres, and we do find patches where the resistance patterns are different. Just depends on the population and where that population sort of originated from. So yeah, there was places at Kempsey that used pyrethroid tags this year and they worked reasonably well, or actually very well. A guy at Bowraville that I do a bit with, he used pyrethroid tags and reckoned they were awesome. Year before he'd used organophosphates and they were no good. Casino guys tell me that the pyrethroid tags up there were no good at all. So the resistance patterns will vary a bit, so it's hard to say, oh, use this one, this will work really well, because I could be wrong. But usually if you go in and talk to the guys at the rural stores, they'll know which ones aren't working because they'll have had a lot of complaints. Yeah, but I guess the main thing is, like, if you've used synthetic pyrethroids, and even if they've worked well 1 year, I'd change to an organophosphate the next year, and rotate your chemical groups year after year. Yeah, but buffalo fly are going to be an issue for us now, indefinitely. There's a bit of work being done looking at releasing sterile males and that sort of thing. So CSIRO and MLA have done a fair bit of work on buffalo fly because it is a massive cost to the cattle industry, particularly in Northern Australia. A few people have had traps, like walk-through traps, varying degrees of success with them. Yeah.
Were they introduced with buffalo?
They came, I don't know whether they came in with live animals, but they came into Darwin. I don't know whether that was on stock or whether they've flown across.
Long time ago?
1800s.
Same as the buffalo and the ticks and that?
Imagine so, yeah. And then they've just moved across Northern Australia and down south. But, it was, as I say, like it was, around 2000 that they were sort of, Kempsey was considered the southern sort of limit of buffalo fly, and we'd see them. Some years you'd see them a bit, then you mightn't see them at all for a few years, and then you'd see them, and now we pretty well see them every year, and certainly they've been down as far south as the Hunter. So they're on the march south, and I guess the further south they go, then the longer season we'll have. Obviously calves vaccinations, everyone vaccinate their calves, 2 doses, yeah. So, you would be surprised at how many people I go to and, I diagnose blackleg or something in calves and I say, they're vaccinated, single dose. Often the cows haven't been done, so a single dose isn't enough. So they really need 2 doses, 4 to 6 weeks apart, and ideally the second dose you'd give at the same time as marking. So when you're, castrating, dehorning if you're doing that, tagging, that sort of thing. So the idea behind, I know some people will just do all that stuff with the first dose. You're not necessarily going to have great protection at the time that you're doing those invasive procedures, and they're the sort of procedures that where we see tetanus particularly. You've got open wounds, that sort of thing. Ringing, if you're using rings to castrate, then you want to be really spot on with your 5-in-1 because I see tetanus most commonly in calves with rings as opposed to a knife, just a different nature in the wound that's formed. So first dose on your calves at sort of 3 months of age, and then the second dose and marking, sort of 4 to 6 weeks later.
What happens if you miss that 6 weeks and it extends, get the second one until 8 or 10 weeks? Is there an issue there? Or?
8 weeks probably okay. The longer it goes, so what happens when you vaccinate a calf, and most vaccines are like this, so that's sort of like the first vaccine you give it, you get a peak in antibodies and it tapers off like that. So the idea is that you want to give the second dose and then it boosts the immunity up and it stays on for a long time. So the first dose is called a primer dose. So it actually just exposes the animal's immune system to the vaccine, to the antibodies, to the bug that you're wanting to protect against, and the immune system starts to produce antibodies to that disease. But those antibodies don't hang around for that long, so you need to give that second dose. If you're 8 weeks, it's going to be okay. It's not like it doesn't just, that's probably not a great representation. It doesn't just cut out on at 6 weeks it doesn't just stop. There's a taper. So if it was out to 8, not too much of a problem. If you're going too far out with 5-in-1, you might find that you don't get as good an immune response to that second dose. because you don't have that priming antibodies sort of still in the system, they've all tapered away. And likewise, you're not, obviously your cows all don't calve on one day, so your calves aren't all going to be 6 weeks old at a certain time. Depending on your calving, like your calving period, you might do them in a couple of batches. So you get your first calves in, give them their first dose. When they come back in, give them their second dose, mark them and give those younger calves their first dose and go that way. And that'll just depend on your system and your calving period.
That'd be a bit of a circus when you calve all in, wouldn't it, like people you seem to do? Because you'd have to tag everybody's eating. I mean, he got one, he's had two, he's had none.
No, so what happens there, and I talked a bit before about maternal antibodies. So normally they're sort of gone by about 12 weeks, thereabouts. So what I see a lot of in those herds where they've got year-round joining or even just very long, the bull might be out for 6 months, is you start to see blackleg in the calves that were born earlier because the antibodies that they got from mum are gone and they're not protected and they become susceptible to those diseases. So a benefit of having a restricted joining and therefore a restricted calving is you can manage those animals a lot better. Like you say, if you've got them dropping all year round, it becomes very challenging to be able to treat them at the appropriate times. So that's calves. Obviously weaning, depending on your system. Wean at 7 months, 8 months maybe. When it's dry, anyone pull calves off early when it was dry? Yeah?
You sold them up earlier.
Particularly heifers.
And even I know a few people now are pulling them off pretty young, selling them because those little lightweight calves are making pretty good money. So in drought, early weaning's done quite a bit, and you actually feed the calf and cow as separate units, and it is more efficient to do that. There's a cost in feeding a cow to produce milk to feed a calf. So in seasons where things are a bit tough, it's certainly a really good consideration. And Todd's, probably more of an expert on early weaning than me. But it's something that
we did it 3 years in a row during the drought, and because we were getting little bits of rain, so we used to calve sort of August, September. We're not selling a weaner, we're selling a 2-year-old. We used to wing them or scone. And we bought our calving forward, so we've been done for a month now. So we bought a forward by a month a year, just by early weaning, and the cows were in good shape and they just went back in calf. So
and there's a question over whether it's a practice that could be done more often, not just in bad seasons. I mean, if you're selling them straight off the cow and you're not going to wean them on your property, it's probably a different argument. But there is an energy or a cost saving in feeding them as separate units, provided you've got good feed for those calves to go on to.
Yeah, so we were weaning at like 3 months, so 90 to 100 kilos, so they need good feed, but they don't need a lot of it. So it was just, it was a no-brainer, and they did really well, and we had no hesitation about doing it at all.
So I think probably pretty well covered. Has anyone got any other questions about what to do when? Yep.
With 3 days, and it comes down every now and again, is there ways you can check to see if it's going to be an issue for the child?
So 3 day. 3 days like rain, I'd love to be able to order it at the start of the year and get it consistently every year. Like 3 days really easy to deal with if you see it every year. Your little young cattle will get it, they develop, it doesn't knock them around too much, they get a bit stiff and sore, they get over it, then they're protected for the rest of their life. We see problems when we haven't seen it for a few years because you start to get those older cattle, 3, sometimes 4-year-old cows, heavy, that's the ones that it knocks around. So if we haven't seen it for a few years, then vaccination's certainly worth considering. Just keeping an eye, like we normally try and put media releases out once we start to see it, or if we're starting to get reports of it, like right up the top, and that'll give you a bit of time, because it normally comes down the coast. Having said that, there's the odd year where it'll pop up down further south, like down near Bulladila, and come back up the coast, and that can catch people out. But vaccines, a 3-day vaccination is certainly worth thinking about with your bulls, particularly if you brought them in from outside the area and you know they're probably not exposed, because it will make them temporarily infertile if they get affected, and obviously while they're affected they're not going to be doing much. So we tend to see 3-day, you know, sort of that January, February, March, sometimes into April, May. So if you are going to vaccinate, my advice to people is make sure they're done before Christmas. So if they've not been done before, again, it's 2 doses, 4 to 6 weeks apart. And it's something to consider, if we haven't seen it for a few years, and we didn't get 3-day this year, very, very little the year before. So, you know, this next sort of summer, autumn might be a time of it.
Stage 2 Ds ago.
Yeah.
Why does it affect the fatter cattle? We used to have trouble some of the show cattle, Charolais.
Yeah.
Why is it when they're...
Just body weight more than anything, I think. But yeah, fat cattle, I think they get hotter as well, so it'll cause a fever. I generally have a few on grain, and a few years back I had some fat cattle that were finished and probably should have been killed, and I ended up losing a few, and yeah, they just went down like a sack of spuds, and I think it's just that, fever, heat and body weight. Yeah, so, back when you...
So there's the tip, don't feed your cattle.
No, I think a better tip would be to, I guess, keep your ear open for, whether there's 3-day about. If you've got fat cattle and we haven't seen it for a few years, then vaccine's worth thinking about. It's pretty pricey, but yeah, for the protection that it affords, it's worth considering.
Once you're vaccinated, does that give them as good a protection as exposure now?
Unfortunately not, no. So vaccination you need to repeat every 12 months, whereas natural exposure lasts them pretty well for their life. It will wear off, so you'll occasionally see a case in an older animal, but when we see it, it'll be, sort of yearlings, maybe sort of 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds if we haven't seen it. So it'll be those younger animals. Never see it in sucking calves. You might see it in, sort of weaners, but rarely. Yeah.
You said in bulls to do it for bulls, do you vaccinate? Bulls?
Yeah, so...
Is that every 12 months in the bull?
Yeah.
For the life of the bull?
Yes, yeah. So, particularly, so if you're buying a bull from the tablelands, pretty unlikely that it'll have been exposed to 3-day. You bring it down here, if we happen to get 3-day in, it can make them temporarily infertile, and it certainly will kill a few just due to their size and body weight. They go down. The virus itself doesn't kill them. It's just the secondary complications from being down. A very, very small proportion of animals do get a primary nerve damage from the virus, so they'll stay, like they'll get up, but they'll be real wobbly in the back legs. But yeah, it's not, like the mortality rates are pretty low with it. It's, probably half to 1%, 2% tops. But if you've got fat black cattle on feed or something and it gets in, it'll knock them around.
What about blight?
Yep.
Blight. There's new, is it vaccine out for blight?
Yep.
Is that, what's the results of that?
So Pilligard, so there's a vaccine called Pilligard for pink eye or blight. So I know people have used it and feel that it's worked well. There's other people that don't think it's that effective. So I'm probably on the fence on it. I think you've got to look at the other things involved. So, we saw a bit long paddocks of Soteria, paddocks with thistles, where you're getting a bit of eye damage, dusty conditions all contribute, fly populations. So I think you can control those other things. Yeah, so I've had mixed reports on Pilligard. You've obviously used it and not loved it.
We used Pilligard, we had the 2 reps come down and they said, oh, it must be another strain.
Yeah.
We used it previously and it had worked fine. We thought,
yeah,
with no result, no outbreaks or anything like that. And then 2 years ago, because it was drought, or possibly, but anyway, it was dust and everything. We got it on all 3 properties really bad, to the point where we rang and had the rep turn up to the front gate. They never even inspected any cattle.
Yeah.
And they said, oh, that's not the strain that Pilligard covers, must be a different strain.
So there's different bacterias. So Pilligard protects against Moraxella bovis, which is a bacteria most common associated with pink eye. There's one called Moraxella bovoculi that it won't protect against. But yeah, there's still some arguments over pink eye.
Our research station at Duck Creek this year smashed, absolutely smashed, all vaccinated, and yeah, it's just been a massive problem getting them all the time.
Yeah.
I used it when it first came out, and every beast I did developed lumps about that big.
Yeah.
So I rang up Cooper's and I spoke to the vet there, and he waffled on about something, but I didn't get any answer. And I thought that it was banned in New South Wales, but you can still buy it in Queensland.
No.
Never been banned?
No.
Okay.
So yeah, I've had a lot of success with Pilligard, but I had some crappy years as well.
Yeah.
And I found that the bad years were years when I vaccinated too late. I'm finding at least 6 weeks before the fly season arrives.
Yeah.
So I'm often doing, September vaccinations, early September. I vaccinate my retained peppers in that first year, then I vaccinate them again in the second year, and I don't bother with the rest of the herd.
Yep.
The last 5 or 6 years, I haven't had a single case of pink eye.
Yeah. And that's certainly, you've got to have got it into them before the season. And as you say, like reasonably well before, because it will take them some time to develop that immunity. But yeah, I have had mixed reports on it. There's a guy in Queensland at the moment doing a PhD on pink eye, and he's arguing that it's not actually an infectious disease. So it's not specifically caused by those Moraxella bacteria, because they have picked up that bacteria and shoved it in eyes and can't recreate the disease. So there is more to it. So he's firmly in the camp that the Pilligard's no good, because it's not, the disease isn't primarily caused by that bacteria. But yeah, we do see it. Some years it's bad. Some people, like Steve, said Pilligard works well, others not so well. So yeah, I don't know.
But it really, is the light actually causing a lot of issues too? Is it coming onto that infection in there?
Yeah, like so it's one of that. I think there's a whole range of factors that contribute to it. So dust, sunlight, damage to the eye from long grass, Soteria, thistles, putting their heads into hay rings or hay racks. There's all the flies. So there's all these things, and I think you could have one of them and not have a problem. You start to pour a few of those things together, and that's when we start to see problems.
So a lot of the premium markets now would say that they don't tolerate any Indicus cattle in, but then when they look at those cattle, they mostly would take them, they're just not showing a heap. The Department of Ag actually, way back in the 1980s, 1990s, had a massive program on the benefits of crossbreeding for the coastal areas. Crossbreeding and also meals, protein meals on boosting fertility. And the impact of Indicus content was really well documented. And when I look at the boundary here, and so Next door to Don's, I see a lot of whiskey grass and giant paspalm, tiny bit of Ceteria, so probably indicating low fertility conditions, not a lot of management input, and that's where your indicus content is really going to be able to help you lift overall productivity. You know, when you have improved pastures, you know, the difference the benefit of having the indicus content gets diluted a bit, but there's still, you know, lots of good reasons why how indicus content can help you adapt on the coast. But anyway, as part of segment 5 in ProGrows, we're going to talk a little bit about the profit drivers, managing fat score for fertility, and so Don's got some cattle in. We're going to have a look at the heifers there, weaning and weaning heifer management and nutrition. So I know it was mentioned about weights for joining and calving your heifers. So Nathan Jennings and I actually put this prime fact out about 18 months ago about calving 2-year-old heifers to rebuild herds. It was specifically aimed at the coast because we could see how calves were going to become so valuable. And calving 2-year-old heifers on the coast is not for the faint-hearted. It does require management and probably some extra inputs, but when your calves are worth $1,200 to $1,600, usually that's a good return on investment. When the calves are worth $500 to $600, it becomes a more marginal call. But in there we have some target weights for your weaners, and yearling heifers, and for joining and calving. So I think 340 was mentioned by Don, and I know we had here as a joining weight, and I know we had, or maybe Don said 360. Anyway, we had 340 kilos here, but what we do have is as guidelines for percentage of the mature weight of your cow. So for example, you can find 500 kilo Angus cows, and you can find lots of 800 kilo Angus cows. Okay, so it's hard to have an exact joining weight for the heifers because it really is a proportion of the mature weight of your cow. So we've got down there that when you're joining your heifers, that they should be 65% of the expected mature weight at joining. Anyway, so there's lots of other guidelines in there. Don't feel obliged to take one, but it does look like the cattle industry or overall livestock industries are going to be riding a bit of a wave for the next couple of years, so some useful information there. So given that, who's in this room is producing and selling a weaner as their primary enterprise? Mostly. Anyone keeping the weaners on, selling them older?
We have done, but we won't anymore for a while, I don't think.
Yeah. Take the money and run? Yeah.
It's like $1,200 on Saturday.
Yeah, righto. Yeah.
I just do pregnant testing calf heifers, do so.
Yep. Yeah, righto. So even your cow price is really good at the moment, and when your cow price is really good, it does give you a bit of room to move if your cow is empty or has a dead calf or something like that, because I know we've sold some cows to Scone this week, and they to Wingham, made MSA, so even the cows were worth $1,700. So it does give you a bit of room to move in terms of reproductive inefficiencies, but overall, as Ian mentioned, you are chasing a calf per year and a weaning rate, you'll be aiming above 85%. Mortality, we've covered that excellently this morning. And the benefits of condensed calving. Although, people have calve all year round for lots of valid reasons as well, because of bull management issues, or they're just not there, or, a lot of other things, valid reasons for your own individual situation. So, why we're going to have a look at the heifers and sort of put a ballpark fat score on them is because it has a massive impact on fertility rates. So fatness is tightly correlated with weight, body weight. So the important thing is the fat score at calving. I'm going to show you a little bit of research data later on to kind of tease it out and support that. But basically, it's a very simple table to say that cows fat score 1 to 2 at calving. You know, this is just the percentage of them that are actually cycling. You know, 50 days, 70 days, 90 days after calving. So you can see the impact of increasing fatness on fertility. So they're just coming back into season sooner. How many days have you got after calving to make sure that they calve on the same date next year? What's the gestation length of a cow?
280.
About 280 to 285, yes, something like that. So how long have you got to get them back in calf? 65 plus 15, about 80 days. Yep. So you can see there the impact of fat scores. So if they're fat score 1 and 2, then you're going to have a few drop out of the system. So fat on cattle is important for all sorts of reasons. So when you're talking about export carcasses, the fat on the carcass there provides protection, stops muscle from drying out. It provides flavour in the meat. So if you cut all the fat off beef and lamb, it's actually not easy to tell it apart from all the other meat products, including pork and chicken. So the fat gives you flavour. Marbling, really important in overall meat quality and appreciation. And then of course, we talked about the impact on fertility already. So when we're talking about fat scoring, the Australian system is fat score 1 through 6, and the muscle score is A through E. So if you listen to the market report on about 5 to 1 on the ABC, and Ross Watson at Scone used to say the C3 cows are worth $3 a kilo. So what's a C3 cow? Anyone know what that means? So your C is your muscle score, so A through to E is your muscle score, so C, so she's moderately muscled, and 3 is your fat score, fat score 3. Your D1 cows, what's a D1 cow?
Skinny.
Yeah, cracker. Yeah, that's right, so she's got no fat on her, so, and she's D muscle score. So, when we're going up to look at the heifers today, we're going to look at the fullness of the brisket, how the flanks let down. Can we easily see the ribs? Can we easily see these muscle seams? We're going to look for fatness deposits either side of the tail head. And I know we did the one of the meat supply workshops at Don's place and somewhere else. That's a couple of years ago now. We talked about this kind of thing, so some people will be familiar with this already. In steers, you'll be looking at the fullness of the cod there and let down the twist in steers and heifers. So that's what you're looking at. We'll get a couple up the race, and when you're feeling cattle, so you're feeling everywhere where there's bones. If you can feel bone, rib, backbone, hip, pins, that means there's not a lot of fat there. There's a bit of give there, then it can only be fat over the top of that. If you, yes?
When you're talking about also the cod too, with the fat when now there's not a lot of people actually physically castrating after either using bands or what have you. How do they get on that?
Oh, well, you're just looking at these other areas, so it's just part of an overall portfolio of evidence to say how fat it is.
Is it less desirable for the buyers, because the buyers said to us once, after we looked at Calving and done the bins, we cut ours, but we found a lot of cows that didn't put bins on.
Yeah.
And they had cut, I'm not sure, but he said
No, I don't think
there was one less thing that they would.
No, I don't think it's a major issue, and also because more and more fat cattle are going direct to the meatworks rather than via the sale yard. So, you know, the feedlot really doesn't have any. If you look at a feedlot grid, it's basically somewhere between 350 and 500 kilos and coat colour. That's basically your feedlot grid. So they did want a certain amount of fatness, but for quite a while now they've kind of been happy to kind of take it as it comes for a fatness. So there's no penalties or premiums for different fatness going to a feedlot. If you're going to the meatworks, even those fatness grids are getting pretty wide. Like at one point there was definitely the sweet spot was around about 5 to 12 mils of fat at the P8 site, and we'll talk about that when we get up there. But now a major deduction if you didn't have the 5 mils of fat, but apart from that, 0 to 22 mils of fat, and 22 mils, that is quite a lot of fat at the P8 site, like that much, is the kind of the sweet spot, and from 22 to 39, I think you only lose 5 or 10 cents. So the focus is on meat quality. That's what is driving the system now. So they're happy to kind of take different carcass weights and different fatness, so long as the quality in there, and that's what the MSA tastes, or the MSA index score is all about.
What about the colour of the fat? There's been like a corn diet that's changed the colour of
yeah.
compared to
yeah, looking at a can, but I mean you've got half of America feeding corn-based diets through their feedlots. Jerseys can have, a bit yellow fat, but no, it's not in the grid, no. But meat colour is in the grid, but not fat colour. Yeah. So yeah, when we're feeling, this is the long ribs, these are your short ribs there, so that's your T-bones. This is your ribeye there. So if we're feeling along these, feeling those short ribs there, see if we can feel the bone, a bit of a poke there along the backbone. So, fat score 1 is basically 0 to 2 mils on the P8 site, and the P8 site is somewhere there. So no fat there. So it is just really a descriptor.
Yes.
So in British breed cattle, it may mean that the animal is emaciated. I mean, fat score 1 is usually not a great outlook for the fertility. And you can see on the Brahman cows there, quite obvious ribs there. You don't need to do any further investigation. But in other cattle that might be in fat score 1 is not telling you anything about whether it's a welfare issue or anything like that. So, a lot of your dairy cattle that are in prime production and prime condition have no fat on them. A lot of Euro bulls, you don't see it as much anymore, but a lot of Euro bulls would have virtually no fat on them. And even now, at the end of joining, when they've got their working clothes on, they'll have no fat on them. Doesn't mean they're emaciated. We're just describing how much fat is there. So a fat score 2 is sort of that more rounded appearance there. If you are looking at weaners, it might make them have a bit more shine about them. So animals that are nutritionally challenged might have a dull coat. And once they, we saw it lots during the drought. And once you give them a bit of feed, start to get a bit of shine in the coat, might lose the rough coats, look more sleek. Have a bit more energy left over for grooming. each other, having a bit of a leak, looking after themselves. But a lot of your cows in that fat score too, and also a lot of your weaners are as well. So they're not fat, but they're not necessarily skinny either. So fat score 2. Fat score 3. Starting to get a bit fuller in the brisket there, quite smooth. We'll have a look at these seams that we're talking about in the hind quarter. So once you get to about 6 mils, 7 mils of fat cover pH site, then you can't see these seams anymore. The fat score goes 4, 5 and 6, but basically, you don't really need any animals in fat score 5 and 6, and you shouldn't need too many in fat score 4, but it can happen, especially this season. Yeah, a lot of people had less stock than they otherwise would have, like right across Eastern Australia. Good season, so yeah, plenty of opportunity for them to eat, have a lot of selection in terms of eating whatever they wanted. So we have actually at the, I'm based at Armidale at the university, so we've got some cameras, Xbox camera technology that we're using, and we're hoping to have as part of the walkthrough weighing systems for Northern Australia and also, bigger commercial operations that can, as well as weighing the animal, give you a fat score to, for example, if you wanted to separate animals based on weight and condition for sale, but also, maybe early wean those cows that were light and or didn't have any, not fat enough. And these are the kind of things that the cameras are picking up on. So this fatness beside the tail head there, you can see no seams there. A fat animal will be blocky. I don't know if you've seen photos of bulls at the Sydney show 40 or 50 years ago, like just shoebox with a couple of legs. So fatness is flat and muscle is rounded. And so you can see there no fat deposits beside the tail on the bull, and there are the seams that we're talking about there. These are some, we had a major muscling trial happening at Glen Anderson at our coastal research station. So these are just some, quite well muscled cows. So when you're looking at an animal, you have to have some ability to separate between fat and muscle to know. So this is actually quite a muscly cow. You might look at her and think, well, she's in pretty good order. She's maybe fat score 2. She actually is only fat score 1, that cow, but she has, because of the muscle that she has in different areas, it kind of belies the fact that she doesn't have a lot of fat under there. So no fatness around the tail at all. And whereas this cow, I would say a bit fatter, we can see some mounds there, and she's definitely at least fat score 2. She's probably in fat score 3, that cow. The bull there, hard to tell because he's very hairy, but you can see that seam there. So I'm saying he's probably, got 4 or 5 mils of fat at the P8 site. So P8 site, so it's really a position on the carcass. It's not a good area to actually appraise for the live animal, but that's the hip bone there, that's your pin bone, and there's a little vertebrae that sticks up there. So about halfway between there and down from that vertebrae, that will be the P8 site, and so that's where they, when your carcass is hanging up, they make a little incision there in the fat and just poke the ruler in. So it's low-tech solution to working out carcass fatness, but that's actually what they do. So I'm just going to show you a couple of slides on some data around impact of fatness at calving on fertility, and this basically is the reason why it is very hard to recover lost ground after the cows calve. It's because their energy requirements go up in late stages of pregnancy by, a quarter to a third. By the time they're lactating, it's doubled. So they need all of that energy is basically going into the calf. The bigger the calf, the more it'll suck out of the cows. So the milk production is dependent on, there's a genetic component there on the cow, but it's also a really strong component of the calf. And the bigger the calf is, and the more he'll take out of the cow as much as possible. So that's why when the cow's lactating, it's very hard for you to change the course of what fertility is going to be like in 2 to 3 months. So this is kind of an ideal range for our fat scoring. So at calving, it's more or less inevitable that she's going to lose weight there, and that's why we have to do our work later on. So producers, for one reason or another, a lot of coastal producers have moved from kind of an August, September, even October calving on the coast and moved that forward into June calving for a range of reasons. Might be a paralysis ticks, it might be because they're selling into the weaner market, so they're just looking for the extra weight. So it's really important, or dry springs. Dry springs can be a pain in the neck for coastal producers if you're calving around that time. So bringing it forward, your cow is calving in the winter. We've already said it's hard to, once she's calving, maintaining the weights of that cow is the best you can do, but it's likely she's going to lose weight. She might lose 50 to 100 kilos over that 3 months. So it's really important that you set her up for enough fat around the time that she does calve. So I like to look at data. This is complicated, but I'm going to walk you through it. So if you ever see the word parity, it just means how many calves they've had. So this is parity 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8. So these are older cows, first calf heifers, and this is body condition scoring, which they still use in Northern Australia, but this is overseas data. So if I was to say to you,
Todd, condition score versus fat score, what's the difference or similarity?
So your condition score just takes into account overall appearance. So it's some combination of muscle and fat. So it's just a subjective thing. I'm just going to look at there and say, yep, no, that looks all right. Whereas a fat score, it's an objective. We're visually assessing it, but we could have an objective measure to back it up by just scanning her on the run. So if I was to say to you, what's our most susceptible age or class of cow in terms of falling pregnancy rates? Susceptible to having low fertility, low pregnancy rates. So what this data is telling us, it's no problem getting cows or heifers in calf for the first time. Even on the coast, most people can get their cows or your heifers in calf for 15 months. That's not the challenge. The challenge is get them in calf again. So that's the challenge. And also, once our cows get around that 10 years old, fertility starts to drop off. So it's an obvious class of stock to look pretty hard at in a drought. Okay. These middle-aged type cows, very resilient. Been there, done that. No surprises for them. And they are the types of cows that should be able to go in calf when they're not as fat year in, year out. You expect them to be able to do that. What's the impact of condition score? So let's say this is, less than 5 mils of fat, so fat score 1, 2, and bottom of fat score 2. This is fat score 2 to 3, or fat score 3 and above, let's say. What's the impact of fatness on fertility? pretty important, right? Especially in the younger cows. With the older cows, as I said, a bit more resilient, okay? Being able to go back and calf with hardly any fat on their back. But for the younger classes and the older cows are very, it becomes much more sensitive. So here we've got effect of body condition score, again, subsequent weight gain. And so this on reproduction in first calf heifers. So we are looking at the first calf heifers. So this is the body condition score of heifers when they're calving. Okay? So it's less than 5. So we're saying these are the skinnier heifers, right? So this was our weight gain for 2 months after calving. So they're kind of skinny, but we really, in this research, they really punched the grain into them. But we still only got about 2/3 of them in calf. And if they were skinny and they had pretty low weight gain, bit of a disaster. Versus if they were fat when they calved, it didn't really matter if they were just kind of static after calving, or the weight gain after calving didn't have an impact. They can draw on the fat reserves. That's what they're designed to do. Okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about supplements, but it's very important to understand, and most coastal producers do, that body weight and gain is going to go up and down through the course of the year. So it's just a natural part of the cycle, and you have to manage it, but you have to manage it. So how do you manage it? Environment, so we're talking about nutrition here, so early weaning when required, supplements, giving those first calf heifers probably the pick of the paddocks, okay, to make sure they're well equipped to do the job, and monitoring older cows. What we say about fertility in your cow herd is that it is lowly heritable but highly repeatable. So that means a fertile cow may or may not have fertile calves, because there's a lot of factors that go into the genetics of it. So it's lowly heritable but highly repeatable. So for those first calf heifers and for the second calf heifers, if they have a calf for those 2 years, they are going to have a calf every year for the rest of their life. And so there is a bit of variation in Don's heifers up here, and I would say, you know what, it's a pretty good test for, you may not want to get every single heifer you have in calf. You may be aiming for about 2/3, because that way you've got some selection pressure on fertility in your heifers. And those ones that, if you push them a little bit first year, they're going to be the most fertile ones for the next 10 years as well. Genetics. Matching the breed to the environment. We've seen obviously a massive move to black cattle, and that's life. But you need to be aware that you have to look after those British bred cattle on the coast. They're not really designed for the coast, and so you have to be aware of that. Selecting for fertility, we mentioned what you can do with your heifers. If you're buying a bull out of a sale and there's all kinds of breeding information there, what would you look at? What kinds of EBVs, genetic data, would you be looking at in your bulls if you're selecting for fertility in his daughters?
Low birth weight.
That's calving ease, but not fertility actually. Fertility, we're just talking about getting his heifers in calf. Gestation length, maybe. The first one is days to calving, so that's the most important one. A lot of bulls won't have that, or they'll have fairly low reliability on it because they've been part of an AI program, so you lose that data. So days to calving is the most important one. Gestation length is probably going to have a bigger impact on calf size, so more likely to feed into a pretty good calving knees, and scrotal circumference is the other one that's very well correlated. So bull scrotal circumference, polarly correlated with, pretty well correlated with calving ease in daughters. So impact of supplements. So this was work that was done in Grafton in the 90s. So it was actually on steers that were on pretty low quality carpet grass pastures, probably not too dissimilar to what we're looking at over the fence there. So in these steers that were getting no supplement, we had a weight gain of 250 grams a day. When we gave them 500 grams of either copra meal or cottonseed meal or whenever these high protein meals, we actually got half a kilo a day, so an extra quarter of a kilo from the meals. And when you bump that up a little bit more, a kilo of the meal, you're getting pretty good response. Now, urea in these steers, we only need about 30 grams, and so we've got 350 grams a day. So I've only added 100 grams a day onto the steers. And I guess that's, so your meal plus your urea is somewhere between somewhere between the meal and the urea by itself. That's as you expect. The take-home message is that urea, you can only do so much with it. You are basically feeding nitrogen to the bugs to correct a carbon-nitrogen ratio that's out of whack in the rumen. There's not enough nitrogen for the bugs to feed on and reproduce. A lot of cattle nutrition, ruminant nutrition, comes from bugs just living on all the stuff that the beast is eating, and the bugs live and breed and die, and the animal digests the dead bugs. So we're feeding the bugs. So we've only increased our weight gain by 100 grams a day, but we've done it with 30 grams of urea, which is, just in cents. So you can only do so much with it, but it's going to be your best return on investment. So when you put your 20 kilos of 30% urea block out, your cows need about 50 to 60 grams a day. How much do you think they can lick of that block?
Not that much.
Bugger all. So your block is not the way to go for if you want to supplement urea. It may be for minerals, trace minerals, although even Ian said that they may or may not be getting enough of these trace minerals. So supplying urea is a really good idea. It's the cheapest form of supplement there is, but you can only do so much with it. So you need to have it out early and often. So I would think that if your rural supply doesn't have bags of loose lick, so a lot of them do have that in now, but they can get it in. So the loose licks, the urea loose licks are the way to go. So I'll just do a little return on investment there. And the return on investment looks fantastic at the moment because of the, the price of stock. But, probably 3 or 4 years ago, it was, this was around about 2 to 1. So it was, and that's what meals are. You can do a lot with them, but they're expensive. So the economics of them is very suspect, unless you are chasing a particular target, which might be these first calf heifers. Okay, you don't have to get many heifers in calf to pay for supplements at the moment. Okay. Questions on that?
I've got a bit of green feeding though, Paddock.
Yep.
Or just green grass leaf. Do I need those protein supplements?
Excellent question. How would you know if you needed a protein supplement?
Well, proteins are all your clovers and
Yeah.
things like that.
So
you've
protein's
got-
going to be,
when you add in with
yep.
just your dry feeds, you're bringing that up.
Yes, you would. Your clovers in particular are very high in protein. how much clover's in lucerne hay or vetch hay or white clover hay. Probably at least, if it's well made, it could be 25%. But even poorly made hay, the legume hay is mostly 18 to 20%, so very high in protein. If you have any kind of green in your pasture at all, you probably don't have a protein deficiency. But if you really want to check, you look at the manure, because the manure is going to tell you about the overall digestibility of the pasture and what's happening in the rumen. So if you've got 3 concentric circles and a plop in the middle of your cow pad, things are tickety-boo. Once it looks like it's being extruded out of a pipe, then digestibility is falling and you don't have enough protein in the diet. Now you can add protein and it's not going to make things a lot better, because the first thing is that you lose out on protein, and then pretty soon after that you need energy as well. But you can add protein, non-protein nitrogen, I should say, very cheaply. Bypass proteins, you're looking at your meals, different story. Thank you. Excellent question. Yes?
Todd, you were saying that you should keep your heifers and your adult cows in good condition for them to get into to join. But my understanding was always that you shouldn't force feed or improve the condition of your cattle in the last 2 or 3 months, because of a lot of it will go to the calf. You could have calving problems more so in heavy fat cattle than you would in medium type conditioned cattle.
Yeah, look, can happen, but I would say rarely. See, there's a lot. I would say it's more of a rural-urban myth, a myth rather. What a cow will do is her first priority is that fetus. So we had a major research project at Grafton. We had to move the cows to Grafton to get any kind of impact on calf birth weight. They had to be starved, because a cow, her first priority is that fetus and maintaining the fetus growth. That's just evolutionary response. So to manipulate calf size through the cow and cow nutrition is very hard to do. Extremely hard. So, you know, in a year like this, you get all kinds of phone calls from producers worried about how fat their cows are, and they're worried about lazy calving or all this kind of thing. What can you do about it? Well, put salt out for one thing, but don't put it out next to your trough. So just coarse salt. So I'm not big into minerals as such, but coarse salt, the sodium in coarse salt, you can often get a bit of a response in that, so far as stock will take it, especially over winter. So if you're worried that your cows are too fat, put the salt up, not next to your water, but on top of the hill or whatever, so that they're well exercised, the same as in people. You know, women that are giving birth should be well exercised, and your cows are the same. So they're getting the sodium, which is important in terms of the overall magnesium, calcium uptake in the diet, and the actual exercise. So that's about all you can do, I would say. It's the easiest thing to do, and it's the low-hanging fruit, and for the most part you won't have a problem. And overall, I would say the benefits of making sure your cows are fat when they're calving at the coast will far outweigh any issues with concerns about the calf being too big, because it just doesn't happen. Like there's a kind of a genetic ceiling on calf size, and there's also like that nutrition ceiling, but the cow will make sure that nutrition ceiling is reached first thing before she looks after herself. There we go. Good result, pretty well grown, right, for a coastal heifer. I don't know where she come from before that. So we talked about the P8 site So the pH site, so there's that vertebrae that sticks up a bit right there. There's halfway between the hip and the fin, so there's our pH site there. So if you ever get carcass feedback, it'll have fatness of the pH site there. If you're MSA, you'll also get a rib fat site. So that's 13th rib, 12th rib, so most carcasses are quartered across there, so we'll also measure the rib fat on the loin to calculate MSA. So, just looking at the heifer, what would you say about the fatness of the heifer? What fat score would you give her?
2.
2? Yep.
Not 3.
I'd say 2, yep. I'm not seeing any, it's a bit hairy, but I'm not seeing any. There's no fat deposit around here, right? Just come and have a feel along the ribs, the back, hip there. It's very... So she's not skinny, but she's not fat. I wouldn't say she's in fat score 3. So she's well grown, which is in her favour, definitely. And still grown, I'd say. Still grown, yeah.
Is she locally bred or brought in from here?
I bought them out of chemistry, and I think they were local cattle. But yeah, I know quite a few guys up there, and I usually try and find out where they come from, and I avoid buying anything because that's not on the coast.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So as far as pregnancy goes, she's showing a little bit of udder, so she's definitely in calf. You see the just a bit of teeth development there, so definitely in calf, but not showing a lot, not showing a big belly. So she's fairly well grown. She's going to be well grown by the time she calves, because she probably still has a few months to go yet, maybe 4 months, 3 or 4 months, something like that. And so she'll be well grown, but doesn't have a lot of, not fat yet, but by the time she gets there, we're going to have a look at the pastures later. Might be able to eyeball kind of some kind of weight gain off the pastures, but overall she's, yeah, pretty good. Yeah, let her go, we're catching another. A lot of yards wouldn't have a chin bar on them, so if you don't have a chin bar, what you're trying to do, a lot of people grab them by the nose. I don't do that. It's a pretty hard part of the body to work with. So I just got my, illustrated what you can do without the chin bar, because a lot of setups don't have it. So I just got my hand in the side of the mouth there, going to put my hip under there so I've got control of the head, and I can mouth there that way. Can't see, but I can feel there that there's no adult teeth there. So milk teeth. What about the condition of the heifer compared to the other one? A little bit better than that, really.
It's heavy, isn't it?
Maybe a little bit better. Maybe a bit more muscle. Yeah, she's quite muscly. Yeah. A bit of teeth development there, so yeah. When did the bull go out?
He's still in.
Oh, when did he go in? I mean, sorry.
December.
What are we in?
Maybe 6 months.
Almost July.
7 months.
So 7 months. So yeah, not a lot of heifers look like they were cycling straight away, but yeah, well, I think these heifers are all pretty similar. So we'll have a look at the orange one. She look like so they can all just go. Look, still doesn't have not what you'd call a fat heifer by any means, but in pretty good shape overall.
Is it a 3 rather than a 2?
No, look, she might be edging up into a 3 there. Just starting to develop a little bit of mound on the side of on the hip there, either side of the tailbone. So, yeah, might be getting up to the top of fat score too. So 6, 7 mils of fat, something like that.
Do you think she's in calf?
Yeah. I thought she was. Yeah, maybe. I just see if she can walk out there. She doesn't seem to have the teeth development of the others. Yeah, no, she's got a bit, yeah, showing a little bit in the udder there, so, yeah.
Too less mature.
What about these heifers? If these heifers were pregnant, what kind of feed are you going to put them on?
I'd keep going ahead with a bit better feed. They're a little bit lighter in condition. You really like enough of those.
Definitely a bit lighter condition. And we, you know, if you bought these heifers and you know they're pregnant, you definitely, depending on the stage of pregnancy, but you definitely want to keep them on a rising plane of nutrition. These heifers, they don't have a lot to fall back on. You know, if they were to calve in the next few months, which they're not going to, but you would expect not a good re-pregnancy rate.
Yeah, the
next
dark
time around.
information
So,
for this one.
you know, if you calve at 2, and often your heifers will have a smaller calf, but you don't calve again until 4, well, you're not really in front.
No.
Yeah, but I know some producers say, oh, you calve at 2 and the cow never grows out, she's not the same size. Well, that's not really an issue. You don't have to worry about that till she's 10, because that's when the salvage value kicks in. Apart from that, genetically she's still the same. So yeah, maybe she's 20 kilos more or something like that. I don't see that as an issue. It just means she's smaller next time. You've got to, give her some feed during the drought. But overall, genetically she's still fine. So yeah, no problem. But this heifer here looks like she could have a bit of limo in her, perhaps. Got that limo colour. She's probably a feed muscle heifer. Yeah.
So what was the answer?
Well, she's.
They can't fit two.
What fat
Miss
score would you be giving the orange heifer there?
Best just to wait a bit later.
That one and probably this one here. Fat score 1, there's no fat on that heifer at all, and she's probably not showing the full muscle expression. She's probably drawn on her muscle to get where she is. If you want to talk about a condition score, she's probably a 2 or something like that. But yeah, it's still moderately well muscled. You can see that over the top line. Like they've got pretty good. Over the top line, they're still nice and flat. Like we don't see any tents there, where you've got a backbone and just no loin muscle there at all, where you get that kind of shape. Unfortunately, you just see a lot of that in our bulls, which is not good. But they've mostly got pretty good top lines, these heifers. And your heifers never express muscle as well as your male cattle, so it's pretty good for my opinion. But yep, definitely a bit of an issue there.
What the story is out here?
Okay, the 1, 2, 3 paddocks here, what I did was, they were eaten out.
What were they originally?
Pasture, sown down to clovers and other things, but they really needed a big dose of phosphorus and whatever other fertiliser we needed. We put that on in December, and then in March we started to eat them out, and then I spread 25 kilos of ryegrass and 2 kilos of clover on the paddock. Then I mulched.
Was there much clover in it before that?
There was a bit of clover through it, but not as like it is now.
Yep.
Then I mulched it, I supered it, and then I mulched it.
Super, you said, but was the DAP you're talking about?
But I put the DAP on in December, but I put 100 weight of DAP on when I sowed it.
As well.
I sowed it.
Yep, gotcha.
And then I just mulched it, and it came up as it. This is it. This is the result of it. It needs, I think, and I'll ask you to tell me what you think, but it needs another 100 weight of urea per hectare now. But do I do it?
Is this one of the paddocks that you soil tested with Brendan?
Yes, we did. Yeah.
Some of those?
Yes.
Right, it'd be interesting what... I'll make some comments in a minute, but you can double check it with your, against your soil tests.
Okay.
As to where we're up to with that.
Well, the soil test showed that the phosphorus generally here was about a rating of about 35. What's that mean? 35
parts per million.
Yeah,
with
parts
the Cobalt
per million,
test,
and I think what
it's about 50 or something.
Is about 50 or 60.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah, that sounds probable.
So Brendan said put out 60 kilos of per acre of phosphorus. Of phosphorus. That's what it needed to bring the level up.
Right.
I think there's the measurements
per hectare.
And so that's why I put DAP, because it has 20% phosphorus, the highest phosphorus rate.
And you said that the heifers were in here last night?
Yes.
So they've only been in the one night?
One night.
Righto. The next over the fence hasn't been grazed?
No.
But it's otherwise similar to what this was like last night?
Probably so on a day later.
Righto. Let's go and have a look over that fence so we can see what this paddock might have looked at last night. While we're going across, Todd made some manure comments earlier. That one and that one. Alright, that's what we want. That's sort of, obviously they've been eating slightly different things.
I don't know how long they've been in there, but this might have been one closer to when they first come in. Don't know how long they've been in the paddock.
Anyone was taking notice of the manure packs around the yards and that they're all looking pretty good. But obviously there's, some of them have been on a bit of rougher feed. So, I had a theory at one stage that you could manage the whole farm just looking at that. Didn't need to look at the pasture, didn't need to look at the cows. Just managing the dung, you could just about manage everything.
If I can just comment on that, the heifers were in those paddocks right out the other side of the silage. And it's very short, and I knew they had to come out of there, but I've been hanging on waiting for this to be old enough.
This is what they were on before, not last night.
That's right. Well,
so which did you
last night?
That one.
That one.
Why?
That one's not desperate, but it's showing that you're getting lower feed quality. So all the sorts of things that Todd was talking about.
More structure, like it's higher, and it's more structure, and the structure comes from the fibre, a lot more fibre. That doesn't have any structures going flat, so there's not the fibre
It's a bit
in
different
it.
to us. Fibre makes us move.
I thought you said that sort of like a pyramid temple was a good pat, very ringed up rather than rings.
Yeah, there's some other ones there. But anyway, just start taking a bit of notice of the dung pats as we move on.
Flat pat, 3 concentric circles with a pop in the middle. And when it comes out like in a cylinder,
that's so much.
that's indigestible. So
everything.
you want
That one there, was that the start of that one, or was that a separate one?
It could be as you say.
Yeah, because there's another dot over there.
Probably probably the same. It's not rights or wrongs in any of them, but if you like, you can sort of say, well, if you're seeing that, if you want to put it in kilos a day, it's doing 0.3 maybe. Okay, so it gets worse. It gets to the point where they're up like this and massive in a drought, as you've seen. Whereas those lesser ones, they might have been doing 0.8. The sloppier ones. And so you can match through your dung shape and whatnot to the pasture digestibility to the weight gain on the cattle. And it's all just linked together. It's plus or minus a fair bit, but it's sort of checking yourself all the time. So if you're starting to see that, and you need these heifers to be putting on 0.8 of a kilo a day between now and when they calve, you think, well, that's probably not going to cut it. Now, my question to you, if I'm assuming that a lot of this paddock looked like this corner here, not the wet bit, but up here, with that much ryegrass is what you were talking about, that would this paddock have looked like that corner?
Probably not quite.
That's better than average, yeah?
Probably a little bit better, but it was certainly better than this.
So what are you seeing? What are you thinking when you look at this paddock, which may not be that different to what you're looking at home? what things are running through your head? How much feed is there? What's the quality of the feed? What can you do about it? What's it telling you about soil tests and sort of how you're going to manage everything along the line?
How long? When did you put in your rye?
At the end of April.
Okay, so April, May, June, ideally you'd like a good,
exactly, and I was concerned that I haven't got as much rye as I thought I would have had. And I wonder why that is.
Wondering if it's because there's more clover that's
Smothering.
taken over.
Well, I'm a bit focused on the clover at the moment as well. A couple of things. When they've come into this paddock, what have they eaten? What did they eat last night?
Not the clover.
It's not the clover, is it? The clover's pretty much untouched. So there's a message there about palatability, and clovers often aren't as palatable as your grasses. They can have some tannins there, they can be a bit bitter, and it'll vary, particularly with your white clover. When it's flowering, it can have tannins in it, which is not a bad thing entirely, because that can reduce your bloat risk. So when we're managing this much clover, you're going to have to watch them for the next week or so when they start getting into the clover a bit more, that they don't get fat bellies on one side of them. There, what are you noticing about the clover?
The nitrogen.
Is it so it's all in clumps, isn't it? If it was spread evenly, you'd think the clover's going to be all even. Maybe where you're standing over there, Pat. Yep. It's going to be all even. But why have we got these patches here?
Because of the cow.
Dung and urine patches, isn't it? So why is this grass bigger than this grass? That's nitrogen. Why is the clover bigger than here than out there? That's number one. It may be palatability. Okay, so don't rule out that they didn't necessarily want to go and have a feed where they just piddled last time. So that don't rule that out. If it was clover only responding, then
so that would indicate some sort of fertility.
In the back of my mind, when I see that, I've immediately got questions about potash, potassium. So that's what I was saying. Have a double check your soil test results. But that's classic sort of potassium response. If the grass was doing no better here than there, then that's really unusual. But the grass responding as well is probably the nitrogen. But the clover responding, that's a classic sort of get out. So, first thing is, okay, how am I going to check that? I'm going to have a look at my soil test results, and then if you're prepared to, get a couple of bags of murate of potash and or sulphate of potash, potassium sulphate, and just do a strip. It can be as easy, simplest way is just chuck it in the spreader and let it go. We want it at probably 1 bag, 2 bags. So how do you do that? You set it up at 1 bag and drive over half of it twice to give it a double dose, something like that. I don't care if you just want to do it, but get 1 bag and do it by hand, just in 10 or 20 square metres.
But what are we talking about? Doing the whole paddock or just?
No, that's what I'm saying. Just do a test strip.
So what?
See what the
rate?
improvement is.
100 kilos per hectare, double rates 200 kilos per hectare.
Right.
Sometimes with potash, be warned, you need a high rate like 400 kilos per, because what you get is a reaction in the soil where you get nothing. Suddenly you hit the threshold and the grass gets some and you see the response.
Are you just saying pick a spot to test it?
Pick a spot like this that's got clumps in it, some good and some bad, do a spot and just see whether you can get a response out of it. Would not be unusual that we need a bit of potash on the coast with our soil type because of the geology and so forth. Not unusual that you do. The animal health warning, if we go and load up, you do a test strip, not a problem, but if we're doing paddock scale stuff, load up on potash, that's when we start seeing grass tetany that we've never seen before. So pastures need more potash than cows need. Okay, so there's a balance to be had. So first of all, we want to see, do we need the potash? It's a bit like putting urea out. Do we need the nitrogen? Then we can make the decision in future whether we put it on or not, which is an economic decision. But agronomically, we want to know if we're getting but your soil test results aren't a bad indicator.
as to where you stand on that. And
Neil, why do you say potassium as against the P or the rest? Because it sounds like you put the P on already, but the DAP wouldn't have had the S in it.
DAP wouldn't have had S in it. Okay, so mainly that and that's where you can scratch around and decide whether it's dung pats or urine patches. The urine patches are where the potassium's concentrated. So that's where you see the big response. If it's phosphorus, you've got stunted and bluey looking clover, and you've put some on. So you probably you need all of them, as we've talked about. And if you've got sulfur deficiency, it looks almost like a nitrogen deficiency. It's a bit yellowy looking. We probably, in this sort of country, you probably need all of them. It's simply that the urine patches are classic for potassium. Sometimes potassium deficiency showing up is a bit like that. You get yellowing on the outside of the leaves. It could be rust and other things as well, but that's a bit, there's not a lot of that here. The other thing that you get makes white clover yellow is a virus, but it's usually within the veins. So that yellowing around the outside of the leaves is, and there's not a lot of that here, but sort of that's another indicator that potassium might be a response.
Now,
So
after you put it on, how long are you got to leave before you put cattle on it?
Potassium?
Yep.
I don't know that it matters that much.
So how long would it be before you saw a result?
Oh, it's usually not, again, usually it's not as quick as urea, okay? Sometimes it's just that it will set seed and come back next year sort of better. You may not see a direct response that quick, so it just depends on the time of year and growing conditions.
But by that time you've probably gone and grazed the paddock anyway. If it's a paddock like this and you want to do a test strip, you're not going to fence the test strip off, are you?
No, you're not going to fence it off. Now this is cheap and nasty.
Yeah.
Okay, we're just going to get out and do a strip. We're going to see sort of if you graze it off, hopefully it keeps raining. If we do it this early in the year, hopefully you're going to see clover for another couple of months, at least.
So you would see a result the second grazing?
Maybe. Nothing's guaranteed. As I said, nothing. Potassium's a bit of a will-o'-the-wisp. Sort of. It's not as quick as urea. Okay, it's got more of a long-term effect, but you can see it quickly. But sometimes it'll be more a persistence question.
And that's what you said there. It's not going to affect the cattle if you graze it straight after you.
With grass tetany, you mean?
Well, the time, if there's a time lapse there of safe grazing after you apply it.
Look, with potassium, you can also get what's called luxury uptake. So the plant actually takes up more than it needs. And so that means that which is an issue with the grass tetany thing as well. So it's one of those things, if we've been where we make a lot of hay or silage, there's a lot of potassium goes off in that sort of feed. So you come back in and put your fertiliser on. So if you put the fertiliser on, then take hay, most of the fertiliser goes out in the hay. It can take up more than it needs. It's a bit funny that way, and that's where you run into issues more so in other areas with the grass tetany type thing. But it is something that we see more of now that people along the coast are using more potassium than we used to. The grass tetany becomes an issue that it never was, because we didn't have the potassium in there in the first place, if that sort of makes sense. So what you then do with sort of your bloat problems and stuff, but at least it might be note to self, if I want better growth, then I'll add potassium to my fertiliser bill. Your beauty, we just doubled it. Or any other favours you want, but yeah, at least you've got the choice then as to what you're going to do. So with our grass, we can do test strips with potash, test strips with urea. Okay, if nothing else. Now we might reckon that these paddocks almost certainly need a bit of urea on them, so our test strip may well be that we just don't do a strip. Rather than do a strip, one strip in the paddock, it might just be that we're going to spread most of the paddock and we're going to leave a strip that didn't, and that strip might line up with, I presume that was a tree or something in there. So you've got to be able to find it. So whether that means sort of tie a bag on a fence, line up with a corner post and do a diagonal, however you do it, you've got to be able to find it, because particularly with your potash, it might well be that you want to keep an eye on it for the next couple of years to see if that's had any ongoing effect. How much feed have we got in here? kilograms dry matter per hectare, and how fast is it growing?
Probably we'd have about 1,500 kilos of dry matter.
That patch, what would we have? If it was all like that, what would we have?
No, if it was all like that, you'd leave them there for 10 days.
Yeah.
2,500.
Clovers are always showy, but they can be quite dense. That's pretty dense under there. We've got a few yellow and dead leaves that we talked about, but yeah, that could be 2.5, 3 tonnes. If it's nice and dense, no trouble. What have we got here?
Oh, about 1,000.
700, something than that. Okay, but there's basically no usable feed there unless you bring a mob of sheep in. In that, so we're sort of across the paddock. If your eyeball averages that and that and that and everything, what have we got in there?
1,000. 1,500.
1,500, and we're going to graze down to 1,000, which means we've got 2 days feed in here. We need 240 kilos a day for those heifers. So we've really only got 2 days feed in here. If they've been down there on rougher feed, how long do you need to put them on this to do any good?
10 days, wasn't it? Their stomachs to all change.
At least. Yeah. So really, if you haven't realistically got at least a fortnight, preferably a month on this sort of feed, all you're going to do is churn things over. So 2 days on this is really not going to achieve a whole lot. Now we've got multiple paddocks, but we've got to sort of be able to, ideally, and I guess what you'd like, what you were planning on was, how am I going to put them on that sort of feed and keep them there for 3 months? Silage might be maize, might be good silage, but they wouldn't feed it until July, so they'd be planting in sort of through autumn, and then when they ran out of feed in winter, that's when they'd start feeding the silage, and they'd be feeding it pretty heavy at the time. Then there was a bit of a change of practice, and when they started planting in autumn, they started feeding their silage, and by the time June came, they had so much feed in the paddock, they stopped feeding their silage before they would have normally started, because they'd been able to ration out, get good pasture growth and ration out. And that's a little bit what I'm talking about here, is start now, because we want that bit of a blend. We're trying to stretch this out, and when we go into that paddock, we'll probably chuck some more silage in there and just see how they go, just to try and sort of stretch it out now, so we don't have that, we're on clover today, we're on old silage tomorrow, or whatever. We're trying to have a reasonably even feed going through for the next couple of months.
That's good for the microbes, the stomach, all that sort of thing.
Stretches the feed out, even it all out. If this stuff does get away from, and also that means that as soon as this paddock's eaten out, that's when we can go and hit it with fertiliser and push it along. They're in that paddock then. If it's going to be a fortnight or more before we go to that paddock, you could decide to take a punt and put some fertiliser, weather's favourable, put some fertiliser out there if they're not going to be in it for a couple of weeks. But ideally, it's sort of, we graze this paddock out, then we move on to the next one, and then we fertilise this one, get it going. Hopefully, sort of by the end of August, or by the time we've come around here again, next time we're in here, hopefully we don't need the silage. But sort of,
the silage because it's just sitting out there. And
it's not making your money there until they eat it.
Years it might be useless.
That's it. If the mice move in from out west, well, they're wrecking hay and silage with gay abandon at the moment.
I mean, he's just got
doing the silage and this
together.
Yeah. What about a cereal hay? Still with grain in the cereal hay? Is that?
I don't. It's whatever I've got on hand.
Whatever you got on hand.
Whatever I've got on hand at the moment, because I know that I haven't got enough of this green stuff at the moment. If I leave that, it's just going to disappear in the next few days, and I can't. I still want to feed them sort of next week. So otherwise, I'm going to. There's not enough green feed there, and it's not growing fast enough. For the next month or more. So I'll stretch it out with whatever I can, and if I've got cereal hay plus a bit of grain, that's okay.
Because your silage has got a higher sugar content, and that it hasn't.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, yeah. And the cereal hay's usually got grain in it.
May do, but that's
so
what
a trade-off?
Depends on when it was cut. Often it may do, and that's why it's a magnet for mice at the moment. Yeah. So Yeah, just it all depends on the detail with any of these things. There's good and bad hays, there's good and bad silages, sort of depends on the detail. I guess what I'm thinking, Bud, is we've got some nice feed here, we'd like more of it, we've got to sort of manage that area that we've got, but we've also got that silage there, and that's baled silage. This is the time of year you're going to use it, but don't leave it to the last minute. Better to get in and simply you just drop a bale in the paddock, cut the strings or net wrap on it. Net. Just cut and put it in the paddock and leave it.
We were here a year ago and we had rye up to our knees, and there's the supplement people say, oh yeah, you should be feeding a high mag supplement when you've got cattle on this lush green feed. Is that a reality or is it just a marketing pitch?
That's a question for Ian, I guess, or Todd. The magnesium is the grass technique thing. It's particularly an issue with some of these winter wheats, the grazing wheats. You start running into problems with that. For us, it's where we've managed without it for a long while.
Well, they're saying it's more of a production, like you'll get an extra 0.3 or 0.4 of a kilo a day if you feed these high mag licks.
Bill Hoffman did something, he went through a stack of them and he couldn't find any science behind it, but he couldn't find anything that wouldn't say. So Bill, similar score to Neil, quite numbers and figures, but he whacked it in the mix anyway, because I don't think there's a lot of science behind it.
There is with some things. We know we need magnesium, Cosmag with for the grass technique thing, which can happen if we start getting heavy-handed with our potash. But so that's one, that back of mind sort of, if I start getting some crazy cows sort of, in 3 years' time, because I've been using potash pretty regularly, maybe I'll look at that a bit further. Or with the winter cereals, and I don't know if it was more with sheep, but they were getting problem issues there with, I think it was low magnesium. So, but with ordinary stuff, in this sort of country, there's probably other things that are more important. I remember one person at one point saying that the big deficiency in this country is vitamin F. Has anyone heard of vitamin F? Feed. They just need feed. So what do we need? Let's start with the feed, and then we'll sort of do the icing. Well, if we've got no feed, they're going to be doing it tough, whatever happens. So when we get some feed, then we'll worry about whether we can make it a wee bit better.
When it comes to the time of the season for excess clover causing bloat and that sort of thing, which is about August or something like that?
It's whenever there's a clover dominant pasture.
As a preventative of it, if you had dry feed, say like a cereal bale of hay or something like that in there.
So they're not hungry, there's something else in there.
Not hungry. Is that to assist? Would that assist?
That will help.
Yeah.
So the bloat thing, how many of you have had bloat problems at some point?
Yeah, we have, when we were out west we did. On
okay, so predominantly it's your legumes, it's your clovers, not entirely, but predominantly. And like if it's white clover, usually when it's got lots of flowers and seed heads, the problem reduces. So you've got to, and for us, usually it's only a month or so. So relatively short period that we've got the problem. Then you've got all your bloat sort of treatments that you can use, or just having that's where that paddock of whiskey grass sort of lets me sleep overnight. So making sure that they've got some rough feed and a bit of fibre, take the edge off it, can all help those things, and it can be your hay or bit of hay or silage.
I don't know whether it's a wives' tale or whether it has any bearing on it. I used to say it was when the westerly winds came through, and that had an effect on
that can have animal behaviour and where they move around. We had a case some time back when Persian clover was relatively new, two farms either side of the river. One farm had no problems with bloat on Persian clover. The other farm did everything, couldn't stop the cows from bloating on the Persian clover. One farm, the dairy was pretty close to the paddock. The other farm, the cows had a 2 kilometre walk to get down there. And by the time they worked it off, they'd passed the gas.
So the others weren't.
So animal behaviour with your westerly winds and sort of if they all stand around and stuff, that can sometimes have an impact as well.
Because that's around the period of time of the year when they were having bloat problems when the westerlies.
Is when the westerlies are on. Yeah. So how much of that is linked, I'm not 100% sure.
That's right. Well,
but yeah, you can talk to two people. One guy's going to say, I'm never going to grow Persian clover again because it bloated all my cows, and the other person says exactly the opposite. So it's always more than one factor in there. Sort of, it's that walking for grazing management. Sort of, did I not? Was there? What sort of grass was there in there? And often what'll happen is which cows will get bloat first.
The ones who don't move.
Fattest.
The fattest.
Sorry?
Fattest.
And why are they the fattest ones? They're your
Big
best
herd.
cow
Because
because she's the dominant cow in the herd. She gets to eat the best things first, and she goes and camps on the best bit of clover and gives herself a bellyache and then lies on her back and puts her feet in the air.
That's a reward.
She's not the best cow anymore. But now there's a logic to sort of why that sometimes happens. It kills you as well as her every time it does. But it's not accidental necessarily. There is maybe a link between why those good cows are the ones that get themselves into trouble, because usually they're the dominant cows that sort of everyone else is following. And the poor little heifer up the back that's getting knocked around by everyone, she survives because sort of by the time she gets there, it's sort of the best is gone.
Yeah. Because this mix of clover and grass and that, is that enough to ring alarm bells or not for a bloat issue if it was in the right season, or is there enough?
I reckon in here there's enough of these good patches that those dominant animals, if they camped in one corner sort of and said, well, that was the clover, then maybe you would get a problem. So classically they would say like 30% clover in a paddock, and clover's very showy because the leaf's flat. It always looks like there's more there than the grass that's standing up. But if you go and cut it and weigh it and do all the things we do, but there's probably 30-odd% clover in this. Well, when they say 30% clover, they mean the paddock looking like this for most of the year, not for a month, which is like we get. So yes, at times we've got to manage clover dominance, but in our country and under our climate, then we do anything we can to grow clover, because we know that most of the year it's not an issue as far as putting nitrogen in the ground and all those sort of things. It's mostly good, but we do know that occasionally you get a dominance like this, and there's some things there that you've got to manage, like keeping an eye. If they're going into this, well, I need to keep a bit of an eye. Right, growth stage of those two plants is identical. Third leaf is just coming through there now. That's the daughter tiller. Okay, so that's the first tiller. That's a new tiller coming through, but they've both. That's the first leaf. That's the second leaf. Which one was which? Second leaf is a bit bigger than the first leaf, and hopefully the third leaf's got. But they're both at not quite 2.5 leaves. So, if we started having a look through here, and there's lots of yellow and dead leaves under there. There's a few regrowth leaves there, so something's had to chew on that at some point. So growth stage is the same. Fertiliser is nitrogen predominantly is the difference in leaf size. It's the same variety. Presumably that's the same variety as that. That's just a soil fertility thing. So, urine patch, how many kilos of nitrogen per hectare is that equivalent to? I think we threw a figure out on that.
It was a lot, very high, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's like, if they're grazing that carpet grass country, it's 500 kilos per hectare. If they're grazing this sort of feed, what they're peeing out could be 1,000 kilos per hectare. We're talking of N. We're talking about putting on 50 when we spread fertiliser. So if you can't see some urine patches, If everything's so green that it's all up and, then the one thing that you're sure of is that you've been way too heavy-handed. It's going to be a waste of money, and environmentally you're a disaster. Okay, that sort of, we don't want to go to that point where we don't see a few ups and downs, but yeah, that basically leaf size is going to be water and nitrogen predominantly. Usually, it could be any of those other nutrients that we've talked about.
So that three leaf stage that you were, or used 2.5 to 3 leaf stage.
This is now,
Is that the ideal time to start grazing?
Yeah. So first thing is, we want to be able to go in and grab some, and it goes like that. We don't pull it out by the roots. That's step one. Step two, ideally, if it's at 3 leaves, then physiologically that plant's ready to graze. If we go in earlier than that, because we're short of feed, that's doable. The nutrient balance, so things like protein energy balance and your minerals, your calcium, potassium, magnesium balance is not ideal till you get to 3 leaves. So if you graze at 2 leaves, like when those, at that point, it's not nutritionally, it's not as good as 3 leaves, as well as that you're going to get less regrowth. Your total feed, if you graze too early all the time, you're not going to grow as many kilos of dry matter in the season as you might have done if you'd have just been able to tweak that management. So that's another reason for putting that silage out now, to give this another week. Hopefully that leaf is then bigger than these leaves, and so in the next week we can, and that would be if it's taking, if it's taking a week to grow a leaf, then it's going to be 3 leaves, 3 weeks. If it grows quicker than that, so be it. If it's 10 days, then you're going to be out sort of to a month or whatever it is to grow your 3 leaves. And that's sort of because of the short days, sort of over the next 6 weeks is going to be when day length is the biggest issue. Once maximum growth rate, if everything was ideal, is probably late August. We don't recognise that until September, when it gets the feed's got away from us, and you think, oh, it's September, but sort of, and then it just depends on whether we're still getting the rain and so forth.
What's the native pastures? What are they?
Australian native pastures. Oh, look, it could be whiskey grass. It could, true natives are going to be Parramatta grass, wiregrass. Might have a bit of microlina, which is okay. But basically, we're talking low production, low quality type grasses, not highly productive. Then there was another scenario there of high natural fertility, etc., which might be a kikuyu-based farm or something. Which and the aim is that we're then going to match our cattle with our markets, with our fertiliser and grazing management and all those sorts of things. And obviously there's potential there to be a bit more intensive in what we're doing and so forth. And you can come up with all the things that you need to do, and obviously being completely biased, we would have wanted to do a bit of soil testing, and we're probably going to have certain level of input. The low natural fertility type stuff, that's fine if you want to run that, but what sort of carrying capacity are you expecting on that? Out of 3 acres on a good day, 3 hectares on a good day maybe, and it might be, if there's a bit of bush involved, then it might be 4 hectares sort of. So how many hectares do I need to own to run a viable herd or not? Those sorts of things were what we were going to talk through, and there was just a few prompters in there that for that sort of stuff. So it's trying to match up sort of our livestock enterprise with what our natural resources are on our farm, with our inputs of time and money and everything else, including sort of, are we going to set stock, are we going to use some sort of rotational grazing, what do we need to do to achieve what we're doing, are we going to fatten steers, are we going to have a breeding herd, all of that sort of stuff.
When you set stock more suitable than I always thought rotational was going to be your best option.
Yeah, it is, but it's interesting when you look at some of that rotational type stuff, the feedback you often get is, we can run a heap of cows, but we can't finish them. If you want to fatten stock, set stocking on a good paddock is probably going to finish and fatten stock because they're going to go and eat the best of it they can, as long as your stocking rate is okay and you're not just way overstocked, then often you'll finish, you might not run as many, but you'll finish them in that sort of scenario. So most of the time, but most things, it's an advantage to rotational grazing, as long as you're applying those three things that we had earlier, feed quality and the growth curve business, and as long as you're doing all of those basics, then any of it can be managed. There's and you can, sometimes you can be as precise, 3 leaves and stuff, and sometimes that sort of, in the swings and roundabouts, that's just not, we're going to do no better than sort of just generally having a stocking rate right. Leave the cows in the paddock. If all of this was opened up, you can have a strip grazing thing where you go out and move the fence every day, or you could have it all opened up as a set stocking arrangement. They're going to stay there for the next 3 months. And as long as your stocking rate is right, you're probably at the end of the day, which one has the advantage in weight gain, you might be splitting hairs a little bit.
Sure.
And you can go different, lots of ways to come into the same answer in some situations.